pretended to catch the soul of the deceased in his hands, which he closed with many gesticulations. He then communicated the captured soul to the dead man's successor by throwing his hands towards and blowing upon him. The person to whom the soul was thus communicated took the name and rank of the deceased. On the death of a chief, the priest thus filled a responsible and influential position, for he might transmit the soul to whom he would, though doubtless he generally followed the regular line of succession. 540. In Guatemala, when a great man lay at the point of death, they put a precious stone between his lips to receive the parting soul, and this was afterwards kept as a memorial by his nearest kinsman or most intimate friend. 541. Algonquin women who wished to become mothers flocked to the side of a dying person in the hope of receiving and being impregnated by the passing soul. Amongst the Seminoles of Florida, when a woman died in childbirth, the infant was held over her face to receive her parting spirit. 542. When infants died within a month or two of birth, the Huron Indians did not lay them in bark coffins on poles, as they did with other corpses, but buried them beside the paths, in order that they might secretly enter into the wombs of passing women and be born again. 543. The Tonquinese cover the face of a dying person with a handkerchief, and at the moment when he breathes his last, they fold up the handkerchief carefully, thinking that they have caught the soul in it. 544. The Romans caught the breath of dying friends in their mouths, and so received into themselves the soul of the departed. 545. The same custom is said to be still practiced in Lancashire. 546. M157. On the seventh day after the death of a king of Gingera, the sorcerers bring to his successor, wrapped in a piece of silk, a worm which, they say, comes from the nose of the dead king. And they make the new king kill the worm by squeezing its head between his teeth. 547. This ceremony seems to be intended to convey the spirit of the deceased monarch to his successor. The Danakil or Fars of Eastern Africa believe that the soul of a magician will be born again in the first male descendant of the man who was most active in attending on the dying magician in his last hours. Hence, when a magician is ill, he receives many attentions. 548. In Uganda, the spirit of the king who had been the last to die manifested itself from time to time in the person of a priest, who was prepared for the discharge of this exalted function by a peculiar ceremony. When the body of the king had been embalmed and had lain for 5 months in the tomb, which was a house built specially for it, the head was severed from the body and laid in an ant-hill. Having been stripped of flesh by the insects, the skull was washed in a particular river, then dyed Bough, and filled with native beer. One of the late king's priests then drank the beer out of the skull and thus became himself a vessel meet to receive the spirit of the deceased monarch. The skull was afterwards replaced in the tomb, but the lower jaw was separated from it and deposited in a jar. And this jar, being swathed in bark cloth and decorated with beads so as to look like a man, henceforth represented the late king. A house was built for its reception, in the shape of a beehive and divided into 2 rooms, an inner and an outer. Any person might enter the outer room, but in the inner room the spirit of the dead king was supposed to dwell. In front of the partition was set a throne covered with lion and leopard skins, and fenced off from the rest of the chamber by a rail of spears, shields, and knives, most of them made of copper and brass, and beautifully worked. When the priest, who had fitted himself to receive the king's spirit, desired to converse with the people in the king's name, he went to the throne and, addressing the spirit in the inner room, informed him of the business in hand. Then he smoked 1 or 2 pipes of tobacco, and in a few minutes began to rave, which was a sign that the spirit had entered into him. In this condition, he spoke with a voice and made known the wishes of the late king. When he had done so, the spirit left him and returned into the inner room, and he himself departed a mere man as before. 549. Every year at the new moon of September, the king of Sofala in Eastern Africa used to perform obsequies for the kings, his predecessors, on the top of a high mountain, where they were buried. In the course of the lamentations for the dead, the soul of the king who had died last used to enter into a man who imitated the deceased monarch, both in voice and gesture. The living king conversed with this man as with his dead father, consulting him in regard to the affairs of the kingdom and receiving his oracular replies. 550. These examples show that provision is often made for the ghostly succession of kings and chiefs. In the Hausa kingdom of Dora, in northern Nigeria, where the kings used regularly to be put to death on the first symptoms of failing health, the new king had to step over the corpse of his predecessor and to be bathed in the blood of a black ox, the skin of which then served as a shroud for the body of the late king. 551. The ceremony may well have been intended to convey the spirit of the dead king to his successor. Certainly we know that many primitive peoples attribute a magical virtue to the act of stepping over a person. 552. M158. Sometimes it would appear that the spiritual link between a king and the souls of his predecessors is formed by the possession of some part of their persons. In southern Celebes, as we have seen, the regalia often consist of corporeal portions of deceased rajas, which are treasured as sacred relics and confer the right to the throne. 553. Similarly among the Sakalavas of southern Madagascar, a vertebra of the neck, a nail, and a lock of hair of a deceased king are placed in a crocodile's tooth and carefully kept along with the similar relics of his predecessors in a house set apart for the purpose. The possession of these relics constitutes the right to the throne. A legitimate heir who should be deprived of them would lose all his authority over the people, and on the contrary, a usurper who should make himself master of the relics would be acknowledged king without dispute. It has sometimes happened that a relation of the reigning monarch has stolen the crocodile teeth with their precious contents, and then had himself proclaimed king. Accordingly, when the Hovas invaded the country, knowing the superstition of the natives, they paid less attention to the living king than to the relics of the dead, which they publicly exhibited under a strong guard on pretext of paying them the honors that were their due. 554. In antiquity, when a king of the Phoenician Libyans died, his people buried the body but cut off the head, and having covered it with gold they dedicated it in a sanctuary. 555. Among the Maasai of East Africa, when an important chief has been dead and buried for a year, his eldest son or other successor removes the skull of the deceased, while he at the same time offers a sacrifice and a libation with goat's blood, milk, and honey. He then carefully secretes the skull, the possession of which is understood to confirm him in power and to impart to him some of the wisdom of his predecessor. 556. When the Elek or king of Abiyakuta in West Africa dies, the principal men decapitate his body, and placing the head in a large earthen vessel deliver it to the new sovereign. It becomes his fetish and he is bound to pay it honors. 557. Similarly, when the Jaga or king of Kasange, in Angola, has departed this life, an official extracts a tooth from the deceased monarch and presents it to his successor, who deposits it along with the teeth of former kings in a box, which is the sole property of the crown and without which no Jaga can legitimately exercise the regal power. 558. Sometimes, in order apparently that the new sovereign may inherit more surely the magical and other virtues of the royal line, he is required to eat a piece of his dead predecessor. Thus at Abiyakuta not only was the head of the late king presented to his successor, but the tongue was cut out and given him to eat. Hence, when the natives wish to signify that the sovereign reigns, they say, "He has eaten the king." 559. A custom of the same sort is still practiced at Ibadan, a large town in the interior of Lagos, West Africa. When the king dies, his head is cut off and sent to his nominal suzerain, the Alafin of Oyo, the paramount king of Yoruba land. But his heart is eaten by his successor. This ceremony was performed a few years ago at the accession of a new king of Ibadan. 560. M159. Taking the whole of the preceding evidence into account, we may fairly suppose that when the divine king or priest is put to death, his spirit is believed to pass into a successor. In point of fact, we have seen that among the Shilluk of the White Nile, who regularly kill their divine kings, every king on his accession has to perform a ceremony which appears designed to convey to him the same sacred and worshipful spirit which animated all his predecessors, one after the other, on the throne. 561. Chapter 8. The Killing of the Tree Spirit. Section 1. The Whitsuntide Mummers. M160. It remains to ask what light the custom of killing the divine king, or priest sheds upon the special subject of our enquiry. In the first part of this work we saw reason to suppose that the king of the wood at Nemi was regarded as an incarnation of a tree spirit or of the spirit of vegetation, and that as such he would be endowed, in the belief of his worshippers, with a magical power of making the trees to bear fruit, the crops to grow, and so on. 562. His life must therefore have been held very precious by his worshippers, and was probably hedged in by a system of elaborate precautions or taboos like those by which, in so many places, the life of the man-god has been guarded against the malignant influence of demons and sorcerers. But we have seen that the very value attached to the life of the man-god necessitates his violent death as the only means of preserving it from the inevitable decay of age. The same reasoning would apply to the king of the wood. He too had to be killed in order that the divine spirit, incarnate in him, might be transferred in its integrity to his successor. The rule that he held office till a stronger should slay him might be supposed to secure both the preservation of his divine life in full vigor and its transference to a suitable successor as soon as that vigor began to be impaired. For so long as he could maintain his position by the strong hand, it might be inferred that his natural force was not abated. Whereas his defeat and death at the hands of another proved that his strength was beginning to fail and that it was time his divine life should be lodged in a less dilapidated tabernacle. This explanation of the rule that the king of the wood had to be slain by his successor at least renders that rule perfectly intelligible. It is strongly supported by the theory and practice of the Shilluk, who put their divine king to death at the first signs of failing health, lest his decrepitude should entail a corresponding failure of vital energy on the corn, the cattle, and men. 563. Moreover, it is countenanced by the analogy of the Chitome, upon whose life the existence of the world was supposed to hang, and who was therefore slain by his successor as soon as he showed signs of breaking up. Again, the terms on which in later times the king of Calicut held office are identical with those attached to the office of king of the wood, except that whereas the former might be assailed by a candidate at any time, the king of Calicut might only be attacked once every 12 years. But as the leave granted to the king of Calicut to reign so long as he could defend himself against all comers was a mitigation of the old rule which set a fixed term to his life, 564, so we may conjecture that the similar permission granted to the king of the wood was a mitigation of an older custom of putting him to death at the end of a definite period. In both cases the new rule gave to the god-man at least a chance for his life, which under the old rule was denied him. And people probably reconciled themselves to the change by reflecting that, so long as the god-man could maintain himself by the sword against all assaults, there was no reason to apprehend that the fatal decay had set in. M161. The conjecture that the king of the wood was formally put to death, at the expiry of a fixed term, without being allowed a chance for his life, will be confirmed if evidence can be added to the custom of periodically killing his counterparts, the human representatives of the tree spirit, in northern Europe. Now in point of fact such a custom has left unmistakable traces of itself in the rural festivals of the peasantry. To take examples. M162. At Niederpering, in Lower Bavaria, the Whitsuntide representative of the tree spirit, the Pfingstl as he was called, was clad from top to toe in leaves and flowers. On his head he wore a high-pointed cap, the ends of which rested on his shoulders, only 2 holes being left in it for his eyes. The cap was covered with water flowers and surmounted with a nosegay of peonies. The sleeves of his coat were also made of water plants, and the rest of his body was enveloped in alder and hazel leaves. On each side of him marched a boy holding up one of the Pfingstl's arms. These 2 boys carried drawn swords, and so did most of the others who formed the procession. They stopped at every house where they hoped to receive a present. And the people, in hiding, soothed the leaf-clad boy with water. All rejoiced when he was well drenched. Finally, he waded into the brook up to his middle. Whereupon one of the boys, standing on the bridge, pretended to cut off his head. 565. At Wormlingen, in Swabia, a score of young fellows dressed themselves on Whit Monday in white shirts and white trousers, with red scarves round their waists and swords hanging from the scarves. They ride on horseback into the wood, led by 2 trumpeters blowing their trumpets. In the wood they cut down leafy oak branches, in which they envelop from head to foot him who is the last of their number to ride out of the village. His legs, however, are encased separately, so that he may be able to mount his horse again. Further, they give him a long artificial neck, with an artificial head and a false face on the top of it. Then a May tree is cut, generally in aspen or beech, about 10 feet high. And being decked with colored handkerchiefs and ribbons, it is entrusted to a special May bearer. The cavalcade then returns with music and song to the village. Amongst the personages who figure in the procession are a Moorish king with a sooty face and a crown on his head, a Dr. Ironbeard, a corporal, and an executioner. They halt on the village green, and each of the characters makes a speech in rhyme. The executioner announces that the leaf-clad man has been condemned to death, and cuts off his false head. Then the riders race to the May tree, which has been set up a little way off. The first man who succeeds in wrenching it from the ground as he gallops past keeps it with all its decorations. This ceremony is observed every 2nd or 3rd year. 566. M163. In Saxony and Thuringen there is a Whitsuntide ceremony called chasing the wild man out of the bush, or fetching the wild man out of the wood. A young fellow is enveloped in leaves or moss and called the wild man. He hides in the wood and the other lads of the village go out to seek him. They find him, lead him captive out of the wood, and fire at him with blank muskets. He falls like dead to the ground, but a lad dressed as a doctor bleeds him, and he comes to life again. At this they rejoice, and, binding him fast on a wagon, take him to the village, where they tell all the people how they have caught the wild man. At every house they receive a gift. 567. In the Erzgebirge the following custom was annually observed at Shrovetide about the beginning of the 17th century. 2 men disguised as wild men, the one in brushwood and moss, the other in straw, were led about the streets, and at last taken to the marketplace, where they were chased up and down, shot and stabbed. Before falling they reeled about with strange gestures and spurted blood on the people from bladders which they carried. When they were down the huntsmen placed them on boards and carried them to the alehouse, the miners marching beside them and winding blasts on their mining tools as if they had taken a noble head of game. 568. A very similar Shrovetide custom is still observed near Schluckenau in Bohemia. A man dressed up as a wild man is chased through several streets till he comes to a narrow lane across which a cord is stretched. He stumbles over the cord and, falling to the ground, is overtaken and caught by his pursuers. The executioner runs up and stabs with his sword a bladder filled with blood which the wild man wears round his body. So the wild man dies, while a stream of blood reddens the ground. Next day a straw man, made up to look like the wild man, is placed on a litter, and, accompanied by a great crowd, is taken to a pool into which it is thrown by the executioner. The ceremony is called bearing the carnival. 569. M164. In Semek, Bohemia, the custom of beheading the king is observed on Whit Monday. A troop of young people disguise themselves. Each is girt with a girdle of bark and carries a wooden sword and a trumpet of willow bark. The king wears a robe of tree bark adorned with flowers. On his head is a crown of bark decked with flowers and branches. His feet are wound about with ferns. A mask hides his face, and for scepter he has a hawthorn switch in his hand. A lad leads him through the village by rope fastened to his foot, while the rest dance about, blow their trumpets, and whistle. In every farmhouse the king is chased round the room, and one of the troop, amid much noise and outcry, strikes with his sword a blow on the king's robe of bark till it rings again. Then a gratuity is demanded. 570. The ceremony of decapitation, which is here somewhat slurred over, is carried out with a greater semblance of reality in other parts of Bohemia. Thus in some villages of the Königgrätz district on Whit Monday the girls assemble under one lime tree and the young men under another, all dressed in their best and tricked out with ribbons. The young men twine a garland for the queen, and the girls another for the king. When they have chosen the king and queen they all go in procession, two and two, to the alehouse, from the balcony of which the crier proclaims the names of the king and queen. Both are then invested with the insignia of their office, and are crowned with the garlands, while the music plays up. Then someone gets on a bench and accuses the king of various offenses, such as ill-treating the cattle. The king appeals to witnesses and a trial ensues, at the close of which the judge, who carries a white wand as his badge of office, pronounces a verdict of guilty or not guilty. If the verdict is guilty, the judge breaks his wand, the king kneels on a white cloth, all heads are bared, and a soldier sets 3 or 4 hats, one above the other, on his majesty's head. The judge then pronounces the word guilty, thrice in a loud voice, and orders the crier to behead the king. The crier obeys by striking off the king's hats with his wooden sword. 571. M165, but perhaps, for our purpose, the most instructive of these mimic executions is the following Bohemian one, which has been in part described already. 572. In some places of the Pilsen district, Bohemia, on Whit Monday the king is dressed in bark, ornamented with flowers and ribbons. He wears a crown of gilt paper and rides a horse, which is also decked with flowers. Attended by a judge, an executioner, and other characters, and followed by a train of soldiers, all mounted, he rides to the village square, where a hut or arbor of green boughs has been erected, under the may trees, which are firs, freshly cut, peeled to the top, and dressed with flowers and ribbons. After the dames and maidens of the village have been criticized and a frog beheaded, in the way already described, the cavalcade rides to a place previously determined upon, in a straight, broad street. Here they draw up in 2 lines and the king takes to flight. He is given a short start and rides off at full speed, pursued by the whole troop. If they fail to catch him he remains king for another year, and his companions must pay his score at the alehouse in the evening. But if they overtake and catch him he is scourged with hazel rods, or beaten with the wooden swords and compelled to dismount. Then the executioner asks, "Shall I behead this king?" The answer is given, "Behead him." The executioner brandishes his axe, and with the words, 1, 2, 3, let the king headless be, he strikes off the king's crown. Amid the loud cries of the bystanders the king sinks to the ground. Then he is laid on a bier and carried to the nearest farmhouse. 573. M166. In most of the personages who are thus slain in mimicry it is impossible not to recognize representatives of the tree spirit or spirit of vegetation, as he is supposed to manifest himself in spring. The bark, leaves, and flowers in which the actors are dressed, and the season of the year at which they appear, show that they belong to the same class as the grass king, king of the May, Jack in the Green, and other representatives of the vernal spirit of vegetation which we examined in the first part of this work. 574. As if to remove any possible doubt on this head, we find that in 2 cases, 575, these slain men are brought into direct connection with May trees, which are the impersonal, as the May king, grass king, and so forth, are the personal representatives of the tree spirit. The drenching of the pfingstl with water and his wading up to the middle, into the brook are, therefore, no doubt rain charms like those which have been already described. 576. M167. But if these personages represent, as they certainly do, the spirit of vegetation in spring, the question arises, why kill them? What is the object of slaying the spirit of vegetation at any time and above all in spring, when his services are most wanted? The only probable answer to this question seems to be given in the explanation already proposed of the custom of killing the divine king or priest. The divine life, incarnate in a material and mortal body, is liable to be tainted and corrupted by the weakness of the frail medium in which it is for a time enshrined. And if it is to be saved from the increasing enfeeblement which it must necessarily share with its human incarnation as he advances in years, it must be detached from him before, or at least as soon as, he exhibits signs of decay, in order to be transferred to a vigorous successor. This is done by killing the old representative of the god and conveying the divine spirit from him to a new incarnation. The killing of the god, that is, of his human incarnation, is therefore merely a necessary step to his revival or resurrection in a better form. Far from being an extinction of the divine spirit, it is only the beginning of a purer and stronger manifestation of it. If this explanation holds good of the custom of killing divine kings and priests in general, it is still more obviously applicable to the custom of annually killing the representative of the tree spirit or spirit of vegetation in spring. For the decay of plant life in winter is readily interpreted by primitive man as an enfeeblement of the spirit of vegetation. This spirit has, he thinks, grown old and weak, and must therefore be renovated by being slain and brought to life in a younger and fresher form. Thus the killing of the representative of the tree spirit in spring is regarded as a means to promote and quicken the growth of vegetation. For the killing of the tree spirit is associated, always, we must suppose, implicitly, and sometimes explicitly also, with a revival or resurrection of him in a more youthful and vigorous form. So in the Saxon and Thuringian custom, after the wild man has been shot he is brought to life again by Dr. 577, and in the Wurmlingen ceremony, there figures a Dr. Ironbeard, who probably once played a similar part. Certainly in another spring ceremony, which will be described presently, Dr. Ironbeard pretends to restore a dead man to life. But of this revival, or resurrection of the god we shall have more to say anon. In 168, the points of similarity between these North European personages, and the subject of our enquiry, the king of the wood or priest of Nemi, are sufficiently striking. In these northern maskers we see kings, whose dress, of bark and leaves, along with the hut of green boughs and the fir trees, under which they hold their court, proclaim them unmistakably as, like their Italian counterpart, kings of the wood. Like him they die a violent death, but like him they may escape from it for a time by their bodily strength and agility. For in several of these northern customs the flight and pursuit of the king is a prominent part of the ceremony, and in one case at least if the king can outrun his pursuers he retains his life and his office for another year. In this last case the king in fact holds office on condition of running for his life once a year, just as the king of Calicut in later times held office on condition of defending his life against all comers once every 12 years, and just as a priest of Nemi held office on condition of defending himself against any assault at any time. In every one of these instances the life of the god-man is prolonged, on condition of his showing, in a severe physical contest of fight or flight, that his bodily strength is not decayed, and that, therefore, the violent death, which sooner or later is inevitable, may for the present be postponed. With regard to flight it is noticeable that flight figured conspicuously both in the legend and in the practice of the king of the wood. He had to be a runaway slave in memory of the flight of Orestes, the traditional founder of the worship. Hence the kings of the wood are described by an ancient writer as both strong of hand and fleet of foot. 578. Perhaps if we knew the ritual of the Arician Grove fully we might find that the king was allowed a chance for his life by flight, like his Bohemian brother. I have already conjectured that the annual flight of the priestly king at Rome, Regifugium, was at first a flight of the same kind. In other words, that he was originally one of those divine kings who are either put to death after a fixed period or allowed to prove by the strong hand or the fleet foot that their divinity is vigorous and unimpaired. 579. One more point of resemblance may be noted between the Italian king of the wood and his northern counterparts. In Saxony and Thuringen the representative of the tree spirit, after being killed, is brought to life again by Dr. This is exactly what legend affirmed to have happened to the first king of the wood at Nemi, Hippolytus or Virbius, who after he had been killed by his horses was restored to life by the physician Aesculapius. 580. Such a legend tallies well with the theory that the slaying of the King of the Wood was only a step to his revival or resurrection in his successor. Section 2. Mock human sacrifices. M169. In the preceding discussion it has been assumed that the mock killing of the wild man and of the king in North European folk custom is a modern substitute for an ancient custom of killing them in earnest. Those who best know the tenacity of life possessed by folk custom and its tendency, with the growth of civilization, to dwindle from solemn ritual into mere pageant and pastime, will be least likely to question the truth of this assumption. That human sacrifices were commonly offered by the ancestors of the civilized races of North Europe, Celts, Teutons, and Slavs, is certain. 581. It is not, therefore, surprising that the modern peasant should do in mimicry what his forefathers did in reality. We know, as a matter of fact, that in other parts of the world mock human sacrifices have been substituted for real ones. Thus in Minahassa, a district of Celebes, human victims used to be regularly sacrificed at certain festivals, but through Dutch influence the custom was abolished and a sham sacrifice substituted for it. The victim was seated in a chair and all the usual preparations were made for sacrificing him, but at the critical moment, when the chief priest had heaved up his flashing swords, for he wielded two of them, to deal the fatal stroke, his assistants sprang forward, their hands wrapped in cloth, to grasp and arrest the descending blades. The precaution was necessary, for the priest was wound up to such a pitch of excitement that if left alone he might have consummated the sacrifice. Afterwards an effigy, made out of the stem of a banana tree, was substituted for the human victim. And the blood, which might not be wanting, was supplied by fowls. 582. Near the native town of Luba, in western Busoga, a district of Central Africa, there is a sacred tree of this species known as Paranarium. Its glossy white trunk shoots up to a height of 100 feet before it sends out branches. The tree is surrounded by small fetish huts and curious arcades. Once when the dry season was drawing to an end and the new crops were not yet ripe, the Busoga suffered from hunger. So they came to the sacred tree in canoes, of which the prows were decked with wreaths of yellow acacia blossom and other flowers. Landing on the shore they stripped themselves of their clothing and wrapped ropes made of green creepers and leaves round their arms and necks. At the foot of the tree they danced to an accompaniment of song. Then a little girl, about 10 years old, was brought and laid at the base of the tree as if she were to be sacrificed. Every detail of the sacrifice was gone through in mimicry. A slight cut was made in the child's neck, and she was then caught up and thrown into the lake, where a man stood ready to save her from drowning. By native custom the girl on whom this ceremony had been performed was dedicated to a life of perpetual virginity. 583. Captain Berg was informed by an old chief that the Indians of Arizona used to offer human sacrifices at the Feast of Fire, when the days are shortest. The victim had his throat cut, his breast opened, and his heart taken out by one of the priests. This custom was abolished by the Mexicans, but for a long time afterwards a modified form of it was secretly observed as follows. The victim, generally a young man, had his throat cut, and blood was allowed to flow freely. But the medicine man sprinkled medicine on the gash, which soon healed up, and the man recovered. 584. So in the ritual of Artemis at Helle in Attica, a man's throat was cut and the blood allowed to gush out, but he was not killed. 585. At the funeral of a chieftain the slaves are sacrificed. A little of their hair is cut off, and then they are beheaded. The victims are generally purchased for the purpose, and their number is proportioned to the wealth and power of the deceased. But if the number required is excessively great or cannot be procured, some of the chief's own slaves undergo a sham sacrifice. They are told, and believe, that they are about to be decapitated. Their heads are placed on a log and their necks struck with the back of a sword. The fright drives some of them crazy. 586. When a Hindu has killed or ill-treated an ape, a bird of prey of a certain kind, or cobra capella, in the presence of the worshippers of Vishnu, he must expiate his offense by the pretended sacrifice and resurrection of a human being. An incision is made in the victim's arm, the blood flows, he grows faint, falls, and feigns to die. Afterwards he is brought to life by being sprinkled with blood drawn from the thigh of a worshipper of Vishnu. The crowd of spectators is fully convinced of the reality of this simulated death and resurrection. 587. The Malayans, a caste of southern India, act as devil dancers for the purpose of exorcising demons who have taken possession of people. One of their ceremonies, known as Akavi Li, has several forms, all of which seem to be either survivals, or at least imitations of human sacrifice. One of these consists of a mock living burial of the principal performer, who is placed in a pit, which is covered with planks, on the top of which a sacrifice is performed, with a fire kindled with jack wood, Artocarpus integrifolia, and a plant called arena. In another variety, the Malayan cuts his left forearm, and smears his face with the blood thus drawn. 588. In Samoa, where every family had its god incarnate in one or more species of animals, any disrespect shown to the worshipful animal either by members of the kin or by a stranger in their presence, had to be atoned for by pretending to bake one of the family in a cold oven as a burnt sacrifice, to appease the wrath of the offended god. For example, if a stranger, staying in a household whose god was incarnate in cuttlefish, were to catch and cook one of these creatures, or if a member of the family had been present where a cuttlefish was eaten, the family would meet in solemn conclave and choose a man or woman to go and lie down in a cold oven, where he would be covered over with leaves, just as if he were really being baked. While this mock sacrifice was being carried out, the family prayed, "O bald-headed cuttlefish, forgive what has been done." It was all the work of a stranger. If they had not thus abased themselves before the divine cuttlefish, he would undoubtedly have come and been the death of somebody by making a cuttlefish to grow on his inside. 589. M170. Sometimes, as in Minahasa, the pretended sacrifice is carried out, not on a living person, but on an effigy. At the City of the Sun in ancient Egypt, 3 men used to be sacrificed every day, after the priests had stripped and examined them, like calves, to see whether they were without blemish and fit for the altar. But King Amasis ordered waxen images to be substituted for the human victims. 590. An Indian law book, the Kalika Puran, prescribes that when the sacrifice of lions, tigers, or human beings is required, an image of a lion, tiger, or man shall be made with butter, paste, or barley meal, and sacrificed instead. 591. Some of the Guns of India formerly offered human sacrifices. They now sacrifice straw men, which are found to answer the purpose just as well. 592. Colonel Dalton was told that in some of their villages the Daggets annually make an image of a man in wood, put clothes and ornaments on it, and present it before the altar of a Mahadeo. The person who officiates as priest on the occasion says, "O Mahadeo, we sacrifice this man to you according to ancient customs. Give us rain in due season, and a plentiful harvest." Then with one stroke of the axe the head of the image is struck off, and the body is removed and buried. 593. Formerly, when a Siamese army was about to take the field, a condemned criminal, representing the enemy, was put to death, but a humane king caused a puppet to be substituted for the man. The effigy is felled by the blow of an axe, and if it drops at the first stroke, the omen is favorable. 594. In the East Indian island of Siu, one of the Sanji group, a child, stolen from a neighboring island, used to be sacrificed every year to the spirit of a volcano in order that there might be no eruption. The victim was slowly tortured to death in the temple by a priestess, who cut off the child's ears, nose, fingers, and so on, then consummated the sacrifice by slitting open the breast. The spectacle was witnessed by hundreds of people, and feasting and cockfighting went on for 9 days afterwards. In course of time the annual human victim was replaced by a wooden puppet, which was cut to pieces in the same manner. 595. the kinds of Borneo used to kill slaves at the death of a chief and nail them to the tomb, in order that they might accompany the chief on his long journey to the other world, and paddle the canoe in which he must travel. This is no longer done, but, instead they put up a wooden figure of a man at the head and another of a woman at the foot of the chief's coffin as it lies in state before the funeral. And a small wooden image of a man is usually fixed on the top of the tomb to row the canoe for the dead chief. 596. In ancient times human sacrifices used to be offered at the graves of mikados and princes of Japan, the personal attendants of the deceased being buried alive within the precincts of the tomb. But a humane emperor ordered that clay images should thenceforth be substituted for live men and women. One of these images is now in the British Museum. 597. The Tabunkas of Central Celebes, who are reported still to carry home as trophies the heads of their slain enemies, resort to the following cure for certain kinds of sickness. The heathen priestess cuts the likeness of a human head out of the shed of a sago leaf and sets it up on 3 sticks in the courtyard of the house. The patient, arrayed in his or her best clothes, is then brought down into the court and remains there while women dance and sing round the artificial head, and men perform sham fights with shield, spear, and bow, just as they did, or perhaps still do, when they have brought back a human head from a raid. After that the sick man is taken back to the house, and an improvement in his health is confidently expected. 598. In this ceremony the sham head is doubtless a substitute for a real one. M171. With these mock sacrifices of human lives we may compare mimic sacrifices of other kinds. In southern India, as in many parts of the world, it used to be customary to sacrifice joints of the fingers on certain occasions. Thus among the Mauritius, when a grandchild was born in the family, the wife of the eldest son of the grandfather must have the last 2 joints of the 3rd and 4th fingers of her right hand amputated at a temple of Bhairava. The amputation was performed by the village carpenter with a chisel. Nowadays, the custom having been forbidden by the English government, the sacrifice is performed in mimicry. Some people stick gold or silver pieces with flour paste to the ends of their fingers and then cut or pull them off. Others tie flowers round the fingers that used to be amputated, and go through a pantomime of cutting the fingers by putting a chisel on the joint and then taking it away. Others again twist gold wires in the shape of rings round their fingers. These the carpenter removes and appropriates. 599. In New or Savage Island, in the South Pacific, the following custom continued till lately to be observed. When a boy was a few weeks old the men assembled, and a feast was made. On the village square an awning was rigged up, and the child was laid on the ground under it. An old man then approached it, and performed the operation of circumcision on the infant in dumb show, with his forefinger. No child was regarded as a full-born member of the tribe till he had been subjected to this rite. The natives say that real circumcision was never performed in their island. But as it was commonly practiced in Fiji, Tonga, and Samoa, we may assume that its imitation in Niue was a substitute, introduced at some time or other, for the actual operation. 600. Similarly, when an adult Hindu joins the sect of the Dara, or Mahate of Mohammedans in Mysore, a mock rite of circumcision is performed on him instead of the real operation. A betel leaf is wrapped round the male member of the neophyte and the loose end of the leaf is snicked off, instead of the prepuce. 601. Section 3. Burying the Carnival. M172. Thus far I have offered an explanation of the rule which required that the priest of Nemi should be slain by his successor. The explanation claims to be no more than probable. Our scanty knowledge of the custom and of its history forbids it to be more. But its probability will be augmented in proportion to the extent to which the motives and modes of thought which it assumes can be proved to have operated in primitive society. Hitherto the god with whose death and resurrection we have been chiefly concerned has been the tree god. But if I can show that the custom of killing the god and the belief in his resurrection originated, or at least existed, in the hunting and pastoral stage of society, when the slain god was an animal, and that it survived into the agricultural stage, When the slain god was the corn or a human being representing the corn, the probability of my explanation will have been considerably increased. This I shall attempt to do in the sequel, and in the course of the discussion I hope to clear up some obscurities which still remain, and to answer some objections which may have suggested themselves to the reader. M173. We start from the point at which we left off, the spring customs of European peasantry. Besides the ceremonies already described, there are two kindred sets of observances in which the simulated death of a divine or supernatural being is a conspicuous feature. In one of them, the being, whose death is dramatically represented, is a personification of the carnival. In the other, it is death himself. The former ceremony falls naturally at the end of the carnival, either on the last day of that merry season, namely Shrove Tuesday, or on the first day of Lent, namely Ash Wednesday. The date of the other ceremony, the carrying or driving out of death, as it is commonly called, is not so uniformly fixed. Generally it is the fourth Sunday in Lent, which hence goes by the name of Dead Sunday. But in some places the celebration falls a week earlier, in others, as among the Czechs of Bohemia, a week later, while in certain German villages of Moravia it is held on the first Sunday after Easter. Perhaps, as has been suggested, the date may originally have been variable, depending on the appearance of the first swallow or some other herald of the spring. Some writers regard the ceremony as Slavonic in its origin. Grimm thought it was a festival of the New Year with the Old Slavs, who began their year in March. 602. We shall first take examples of the mimic death of the carnival, which always falls before the other in the calendar. M174. At Frosinone, in Latium, about halfway between Rome and Naples, the dull monotony of life in a provincial Italian town is agreeably broken on the last day of the carnival by the ancient festival known as a Radica. About 4 o'clock in the afternoon, the town band, playing lively tunes and followed by a great crowd, proceeds to the Piazza del Plebiscito, where is the sub-prefecture as well as the rest of the government buildings. Here, in the middle of the square, the eyes of the expectant multitude are greeted by the sight of an immense car decked with many-colored festoons and drawn by 4 horses. Mounted on the car is a huge chair, on which sits enthroned the majestic figure of the carnival, a man of stucco about 9 feet high with a rubicund and smiling countenance. Enormous boots, a tin helmet like those which graze the heads of officers of the Italian Marine, and a coat of many colors embellished with strange devices, adorn the outward man of this stately personage. His left hand rests on the arm of the chair, while with his right he gracefully salutes the crowd, being moved to this act of civility by a string which is pulled by a man who modestly shrinks from publicity under the mercy seat. And now the crowd, surging excitedly round the car, gives vent to its feelings in wild cries of joy, gentle and simple being mixed up together in all dancing furiously the saltarello. A special feature of the festival is that everyone must carry in his hand what is called a radica root, by which is meant a huge leaf of the aloe or rather the agave. Anyone who ventured into the crowd without such a leaf would be unceremoniously hustled out of it, unless indeed he bore as a substitute a large cabbage at the end of a long stick or a bunch of grass curiously plaited. When the multitude, after a short turn, has escorted the slow-moving car to the gate of the sub-prefecture, they halt, and the car, jolting over the uneven ground, rumbles into the courtyard. A hush now falls on the crowd, their subdued voices sounding, according to the description of one who has heard them, like the murmur of a troubled sea. All eyes are turned anxiously to the door from which the sub-prefect, himself and the other representatives of the majesty of the law are expected to issue and pay their homage to the hero of the hour. A few moments of suspense and then a storm of cheers and hand-clapping salutes, the appearance of the dignitaries, as they file out and, descending the staircase, take their place in the procession. The hymn of the carnival is now thundered out, after which, amid a deafening roar, aloe leaves and cabbages are whirled aloft and descend impartially on the heads of the just and the unjust, who lend fresh zest to the proceedings by engaging in a free fight. When these preliminaries have been concluded to the satisfaction of all concerned, the procession gets underway. The rear is brought up by a cart laden with barrels of wine and policemen, the latter engaged in the congenial task of serving out wine to all who ask for it, while a most internecine struggle, accompanied by a copious discharge of yells, blows, and blasphemy, goes on among the surging crowd, at the cart's tail in their anxiety not to miss the glorious opportunity of intoxicating themselves at the public expense. Finally, after the procession has paraded the principal streets in this majestic manner, the effigy of Carnival is taken to the middle of a public square, stripped of his finery, laid on a pile of wood, and burned amid the cries of the multitude, who thundering out once more the song of the carnival fling their so-called roots on the pyre and give themselves up without restraint to the pleasures of the dance. 603. M175, in the Abruzzi a pasteboard figure of the carnival is carried by 4 grave diggers with pipes in their mouths and bottles of wine slung at their shoulder belts. In front walks the wife of the carnival, dressed in mourning and dissolved in tears. From time to time the company halts, and, while the wife addresses the sympathizing public, the grave diggers refresh the inner man with a pull at the bottle. In the open square the mimic corpse is laid on a pyre, and to the roll of drums, the shrill screams of the women, and the gruffer cries of the men a light is set to it. While the figure burns, chestnuts are thrown about among the crowd. Sometimes the carnival is represented by a straw man at the top of a pole, which is borne through the town by a troop of mummers in the course of the afternoon. When evening comes on, 4 of the mummers hold out a quilt or sheet by the corners, and the figure of the carnival is made to tumble into it. The procession is then resumed, the performers weeping crocodile tears and emphasizing the poignancy of their grief by the help of saucepans and dinner bells. Sometimes, again, in the Abruzzi the dead carnival is personified by a living man who lies in a coffin, attended by another who acts the priest and dispenses holy water in great profusion from a bathing tub. 604. In Malta the death of the carnival used to be mourned by women on the last day of the merry festival. Clad from head to foot in black mantles, they carried through the streets of the city the linen effigy of a corpse, stuffed with straw or hay and decked with leaves and oranges. As they carried it, they chanted dirges, stopping after every verse to howl like professional mourners. The custom came to an end about the year 1737. 605. M176, at Lerida, in Catalonia, the funeral of the carnival was witnessed by an English traveller in 1877. On the last Sunday of the carnival a grand procession of infantry, cavalry, and maskers of many sorts, some on horseback and some in carriages, escorted the grand car of his Grispau, Pi, as the effigy was called, in triumph through the principal streets. For 3 days the revelry ran high, and then at midnight on the last day of the carnival the same procession again wound through the streets, but under a different aspect and for a different end. The triumphal car was exchanged for a hearse, in which reposed the effigy of his dead grace, a troop of maskers, who in the first procession had played the part of students of folly with many a merry quip and jest, now, robed as priests and bishops, paced slowly along holding aloft huge lighted tapers and singing a dirge. All the mummers wore crape, and all the horsemen carried blazing flambeaux. Down the high street, between the lofty, many-storied, and balconied houses, where every window, every balcony, every housetop, was crammed with a dense mass of spectators, all dressed and masked in fantastic gorgeousness, the procession took its melancholy way. Over the scene flashed and played the shifting cross lights and shadows from the moving torches, red and blue Bengal lights flared up and died out again. And above the trampling of the horses and the measured tread of the marching multitude rose the voices of the priests chanting the Requiem, while the military band struck in with the solemn roll of the muffled drums. On reaching the principal square the procession halted, a burlesque funeral oration was pronounced over the defunct Paupai, and the lights were extinguished. Immediately the devil and his angels darted from the crowd, seized the body and fled away with it, hotly pursued by the whole multitude, yelling, screaming, and cheering. Naturally the fiends were overtaken and dispersed, and the sham corpse, rescued from their clutches, was laid in a grave that had been made ready for its reception. Thus the Carnival of 1877 at Lerida died and was buried. 606. M177, a ceremony of the same sort is observed in Provence on Ash Wednesday. An effigy called Caramantron, whimsically attired, is drawn in a chariot or borne on a litter, accompanied by the populace in grotesque costumes, who carry gourds full of wine and drain them with all the marks, real or affected, of intoxication. At the head of the procession are some men disguised as judges and barristers, and a tall gaunt personage who masquerades as Lend. Behind them follow young people mounted on miserable hacks and attired as mourners who pretend to bewail the fate that is in store for Caramantron. In the principal square the procession halts, the tribunal is constituted, and Caramantron placed at the bar. After a formal trial he is sentenced to death amid the groans of the mob. The barrister, who defended him, embraces his client for the last time. The officers of justice do their duty. The condemned is set with his back to a wall and hurried into eternity under a shower of stones. The sea or a river receives his mangled remains. 607. At La Suc in the department of Vienne, young people, attired in long mourning robes and with woebegone countenances, carry an effigy down to the river on Ash Wednesday and throw it into the river, crying, "Carnival is dead! Carnival is dead!" 608. Throughout nearly the whole of the Ardennes it was and still is customary, on Ash Wednesday to burn an effigy which is supposed to represent the Carnival, while appropriate verses are sung round about the blazing figure. Very often an attempt is made to fashion the effigy in the likeness of the husband who is reputed to be least faithful to his wife of any in the village. As might perhaps have been anticipated, the distinction of being selected for portraiture under these painful circumstances has a slight tendency to breed domestic jars, especially when the portrait is burned in front of the house of the gay deceiver whom it represents, while a powerful chorus of caterwauls, groans, and other melodious sounds bears public testimony to the opinion which his friends and neighbors entertain of his private virtues. In some villages of the Ardennes a young man of flesh and blood, dressed up in hay and straw, used to act the part of Shrove Tuesday, Mardi Gras, as a personification of the carnival is often called in France after the last day of the period, which he personates. He was brought before a mock tribunal, and being condemned to death was placed with his back to a wall, like a soldier at a military execution, and fired it with blank cartridges. At Vrigny-aux-Bois, one of these harmless buffoons, named Thierry, was accidentally killed by a wad that had been left in a musket of the firing party. When poor Shrove Tuesday dropped under the fire, the applause was loud and long, he did it so naturally. But when he did not get up again, they ran to him and found him a corpse. Since then there have been no more of these mock executions in the Ardennes. 609. In Franche-Comté people used to make an effigy of Shrove Tuesday on Ash Wednesday, and carry it about the streets to the accompaniment of songs. Then they brought it to the public square, where the offender was tried in front of the town hall. Judges muffled in old red curtains and holding big books in their hands pronounced sentence of death. The mode of execution varied with the place. Sometimes it was burning, sometimes drowning, sometimes decapitation. In the last case the effigy was provided with tubes of blood, which spouted gore at the critical moment, making a profound impression on the minds of children, some of whom wept bitterly at the sight. Meantime the onlookers uttered piercing cries and appeared to be plunged in the deepest grief. The proceedings generally wound up in the evening with a ball, which the young, married people were obliged to provide for the public entertainment. Otherwise their slumbers were apt to be disturbed by the discordant notes of a cat's concert chanted under their windows. 610. M178. In Normandy on the evening of Ash Wednesday it used to be the custom to hold a celebration called the burial of Shrove Tuesday. A squalid effigy scantily clothed in rags, a battered old hat crushed down on his dirty face, his great round paunch stuffed with straw, represented the disreputable old rake who after a long course of dissipation was now about to suffer for his sins. Hoisted on the shoulders of a sturdy fellow, who pretended to stagger under the burden, this popular personification of the carnival promenaded the streets for the last time in a manner the reverse of triumphal, preceded by a drummer and accompanied by a jeering rabble, among whom the urchins and all the tag-rag and bobtail of the town mustered in great force. The figure was carried about by the flickering light of torches to the discordant din of shovels and tongs, pots and pans, horns and kettles, mingled with hootings, groans, and hisses. From time to time the procession halted, and a champion of morality accused the broken-down old sinner of all the excesses he had committed and for which he was now about to be burned alive. The culprit, having nothing to urge in his own defense, was thrown on a heap of straw, a torch was put to it, and a great blaze shot up, to the delight of the children who frisked round it screaming out some old popular verses about the death of the carnival. Sometimes the effigy was rolled down the slope of a hill before being burned. 611, at St. Lo the ragged effigy of Shrove Tuesday was followed by his widow, a big burly lout dressed as a woman with a crape veil, who emitted sounds of lamentation and woe in a stentorian voice. After being carried about the streets on a litter attended by a crowd of maskers, the figure was thrown into the river Vire. The final scene has been graphically described by Madame Octafoilette as she witnessed it in her childhood some 50 years ago. My parents invited friends to see, from the top of the tower of Jean Couillard, the funeral procession passing. It was there that, quaffing lemonade, the only refreshment allowed, because of the fast, we witnessed at nightfall a spectacle of which I shall always preserve a lively recollection. At our feet flowed the Vire under its old stone bridge. On the middle of the bridge lay the figure of Shrove Tuesday on a litter of leaves, surrounded by scores of maskers dancing, singing, and carrying torches. Some of them in their motley costumes ran along the parapet like fiends. The rest, worn out with their revels, sat on the posts and dozed. Soon the dancing stopped, and some of the troop, seizing a torch, set fire to the effigy, after which they flung it into the river with redoubled shouts and clamor. The man of straw, soaked with resin, floated away burning down the stream of the Vire, lighting up with its funeral fires the woods on the bank and the battlements of the old castle in which Louis I and Francis I had slept. When the last glimmer of the blazing phantom had vanished, like a falling star, at the end of the valley, everyone withdrew, crowd and maskers alike, and we quitted the ramparts with our guests. As we returned home my father sang gaily the old popular song. Shrove Tuesday is dead and his wife has got his shabby pocket handkerchief and his cracked old pot. Sing high, sing low, Shrove Tuesday will come back no more. He will come back. He will come back. We cried warmly, clapping our hands. And he did come back next year, and I think I should see him still, if, after the lapse of half a century, I returned to the land of my birth. 612. M179. In Upper Brittany the burial of Shrove Tuesday or the carnival is sometimes performed in a ceremonious manner. 4 young fellows carry a straw man or one of their companions, and are followed by a funeral procession. A show is made of depositing the pretended corpse in the grave, after which the bystanders make believe to mourn, crying out in melancholy tones, "Ah, my poor little Shrove Tuesday." The boy who played the part of Shrove Tuesday bears the name for the whole year. 613. At Lesneven in Lower Brittany it was formerly the custom on Ash Wednesday to burn a straw man, covered with rags, after he had been promenaded about the town. He was followed by a representative of Shrove Tuesday clothed with sardines and cod's tails. 614. At Pontavon in Finisterre an effigy, representing the carnival used to be thrown from the quay into the sea on the morning of Ash Wednesday. 615. At La Rochelle the porters and sailors carried about a man of straw representing Shrove Tuesday, then burned it on Ash Wednesday and flung the ashes into the sea. 616. In Saint-Onge and Onnes, which correspond roughly to the modern departments of Charente, children used to drown or burn a figure of the carnival on the morning of Ash Wednesday. 617. The beginning of Lent in England was formerly marked by a custom which has now fallen into disuse. A figure, made up of straw and cast-off clothes, was drawn or carried through the streets amid much noise and merriment. After which it was either burned, shot at, or thrown down a chimney. This image went by the name of Jack-o'-lantern, and was by some supposed to represent Judas Iscariot. 618. M180. A Bohemian form of the custom of burying the carnival has been already described. 619. The following Swabian form is obviously similar. In the neighborhood of Tübingen on Shrove Tuesday a straw man, called the Shrovetide Bear, is made up. He is dressed in a pair of old trousers, and a fresh black pudding or 2 squirts filled with blood are inserted in his neck. After a formal condemnation he is beheaded, laid in a coffin, and on Ash Wednesday is buried in the churchyard. This is called burying the carnival. 620. Amongst some of the Saxons of Transylvania the carnival is hanged. Thus at Browler on Ash Wednesday or Shrove Tuesday 2 end, 2 chestnut horses draw a sledge on which is placed a straw man swathed in a white cloth. Beside him is a cartwheel which is kept turning round. 2 lads disguised as old men follow the sledge lamenting. The rest of the village lads, mounted on horseback and decked with ribbons, accompany the procession, which is headed by 2 girls crowned with evergreen and drawn in a wagoner's sledge. A trial is held under a tree, at which lads, disguised as soldiers, pronounce sentence of death. The 2 old men try to rescue the straw man and to fly with him, but to no purpose. He is caught by the 2 girls and handed over to the executioner, who hangs him on a tree. In vain the old men try to climb up the tree and take him down. They always tumble down, and at last in despair they throw themselves on the ground and weep and howl for the hanged man. An official then makes a speech in which he declares that the carnival was condemned to death because he had done them harm by wearing out their shoes and making them tired and sleepy. 621. At the burial of Carnival in Locraine, a man, dressed as a woman in black clothes, is carried on a litter or bier by 4 men. He is lamented over by men disguised as women in black clothes, then thrown down before the village dung heap, drenched with water, buried in the dung heap, and covered with straw. 622. Similarly in Skorzingen, near Schaumburg, the carnival, Shrovetide, fool was carried all about the village on a bier, preceded by a man dressed in white, and followed by a devil who was dressed in black and carried chains, which he clanked. 1. Of the train collected gifts. After the procession the fool was buried, under straw and dung. 623. In Rottweil the carnival fool is made drunk, on Ash Wednesday and buried under straw amid loud lamentation. 624. In Wormlingen the fool is represented by a young fellow involved in straw, who is led about the village by a rope as a bear on Shrove Tuesday and the preceding day. He dances to the flute. Then on Ash Wednesday a straw man is made, placed on a trough, carried out of the village to the sound of drums and mournful music, and buried in a field. 625. In Altdorf and Weingarten on Ash Wednesday the fool, represented by a straw man, is carried about and then thrown into the water to the accompaniment of melancholy music. In other villages of Swabia the part of fool is played by a live person, who is thrown into the water after being carried about in procession. 626. At Bough, in Westphalia, a straw man is made on Shrove Tuesday and thrown into the river amid rejoicings. This is called, as usual, burying the carnival. 627. At Bergbrach, in Bavaria, it used to be customary, as a public pastime, to hold a sort of court of justice on Ash Wednesday. The accused was a straw man, on whom was laid the burden of all the notorious transgressions that had been committed in the course of the year. 12 chosen maidens sat in judgment and pronounced sentence, and a single advocate pleaded the cause of the public scapegoat. Finally, the effigy was burned, and thus all the offenses that had created a scandal in the community during the year were symbolically atoned for. We can hardly doubt that this custom of burning a straw man on Ash Wednesday for the sins of a whole year is only another form of the custom, observed on this same day in so many other places, of burning an effigy which is supposed to embody and to be responsible for all the excesses committed during the license of the carnival. M181. In Greece, a ceremony of the same sort was witnessed at Pylos by Mr. E. L. Tilton in 1895. On the evening of the first day of the Greek Lent, which fell that year on the 25th of February, an effigy with a grotesque mask for a face was borne about the streets on a bier, preceded by a mock priest with long white beard. Other functionaries surrounded the bier and two torchbearers walked in advance. The procession moved slowly, to melancholy music played by a pipe and drum. A final halt was made in the public square, where a circular space was kept clear of the surging crowd. Here a bonfire was kindled, and round it the priest led a wild dance to the same droning music. When the frenzy was at its height, the chief performer put tow on the effigy and set fire to it, and while it blazed he resumed his mad career, brandishing torches and tearing off his venerable beard to add fuel to the flames. 628. On the evening of Shrove Tuesday, the Esthonians make a straw figure called Metsikor, with spirit. One year it is dressed with a man's coat and hat, next year, with a hood and a petticoat. This figure is stuck on a long pole, carried across the boundary of the village with loud cries of joy, and fastened to the top of a tree in the wood. The ceremony is believed to be a protection against all kinds of misfortune. 629. M182. Sometimes at these Shrovetide or Lenten ceremonies the resurrection of the pretended dead person is enacted. Thus, in some parts of Swabia on Shrove Tuesday Drive, Ironbeard professes to bleed a sick man, who thereupon falls as dead to the ground. But the doctor at last restores him to life, by blowing air into him through a tube. 630. In the Harz Mountains, when carnival is over, a man is laid on a baking trough and carried with dirges to a grave. But in the grave a glass of brandy is buried instead of the man. A speech is delivered and then the people return to the village green, or meeting place, where they smoke the long clay pipes which are distributed at funerals. On the morning of Shrove Tuesday in the following year the brandy is dug up and the festival begins by everyone tasting the spirit which, as the phrase goes, has come to life again. 631. Section 4. Carrying out death. M183. The ceremony of carrying out death presents much the same features as burying the carnival, except that the carrying out of death is generally followed by a ceremony, or at least accompanied by a profession, of bringing in summer, spring, or life. Thus in Middle Franken, a province of Bavaria, on the fourth Sunday in Lent, the village urchins used to make a straw effigy of death, which they carried about with burlesque palm through the streets, and afterwards burn with loud cries beyond the bounds. 632. The Frankish custom is thus described by a writer of the 16th century. At Midland, the season when the church bids us rejoice, the young people of my native country make a straw image of death, and fastening it to a pole carry it with shouts to the neighboring villages. By some they are kindly received, and after being refreshed with milk, peas, and dried pears, the usual food of that season, are sent home again. Others, however, treat them with anything but hospitality. 4. Looking on them as harbingers of misfortune, to wit of death, they drive them from their boundaries with weapons and insults. 633. In the villages near Erlangen, when the fourth Sunday in Lent came round, the peasant girls used to dress themselves in all their finery with flowers in their hair. Thus attired they repaired to the neighboring town, carrying puppets which were adorned with leaves and covered with white cloth. These they took from house to house in pairs, stopping at every door where they expected to receive something, and singing a few lines in which they announced that it was mid-Lent and that they were about to throw death into the water. When they had collected some trifling gratuities they went to the river Regnitz and flung the puppets representing death into the stream. This was done to ensure a fruitful and prosperous year. Further, it was considered a safeguard against pestilence and sudden death. 634. At Nuremberg, girls of 7 to 18 years of age go through the streets bearing a little open coffin, in which is a doll hidden under a shroud. Others carry a beech branch, with an apple fastened to it for a head, in an open box. They sing, "We carry death into the water, it is well," or "We carry death into the water, carry him in and out again." 635. In other parts of Bavaria the ceremony took place on the Saturday before the fifth Sunday in Lent, and the performers were boys or girls, according to the sex of the last person who died in the village. The figure was thrown into water or buried in a sacred place, for example under moss in the forest, that no one might find death again. Then early on Sunday morning the children went from house to house singing a song in which they announced the glad tidings that death was gone. 636. In some parts of Bavaria down to 1780 it was believed that a fatal epidemic would ensue if the custom of carrying out death were not observed. 637. M184. In some villages of Thuringen, on the fourth Sunday of Lent, the children used to carry a puppet of birken twigs through the village, and then threw it into a pool, while they sang, "We carry the old death out, behind the herdsman's old house. We have got summer, and crotons. Power is destroyed." 638. At Dobschwitz or Dobschwitz, near Genoa, the ceremony of driving out death is or was annually observed on the 1st of March. The young people make up a figure of straw or the like materials, dress it in old clothes, which they have begged from houses in the village, and carry it out and throw it into the river. On returning to the village they break the good news to the people, and receive eggs and other victuals as a reward. The ceremonies or was supposed to purify the village and to protect the inhabitants from sickness and plague. In other villages of Thuringen, in which the population was originally Slavonic, the carrying out of the puppet is accompanied with the singing of a song, which begins, "Now we carry death out of the village and spring into the village." 639. At the end of the 17th and beginning of the 18th century the custom was observed in Thuringen as follows. The boys and girls made an effigy of straw or the like materials, but the shape of the figure varied from year to year. In one year it would represent an old man, in the next an old woman, in the third a young man, and in the fourth a maiden, and the dress of the figure varied with the character it personated. There used to be a sharp contest as to where the effigy was to be made, for the people thought that the house from which it was carried forth would not be visited with death that year. Having been made, the puppet was fastened to a pole and carried by a girl if it represented an old man, but by a boy if it represented an old woman. Thus, it was borne in procession, the young people holding sticks in their hands, and singing that they were driving out death. When they came to water they threw the effigy into it and ran hastily back, fearing that it might jump on their shoulders and wring their necks. They also took care not to touch it, lest it should dry them up. On their return they beat the cattle with the sticks, believing that this would make the animals fat or fruitful. Afterwards they visited the house or houses from which they had carried the image of death, where they received a dole of half-boiled peas. 640. The custom of carrying out death was practiced also in Saxony. At Leipzig the bastards and public women used to make a straw effigy of death every year at Midland. This they carried through all the streets with songs and shewed it to the young married women. Finally they threw it into the river Parth. By this ceremony they professed to make the young wives fruitful, to purify the city, and to protect the inhabitants for that year from plague and other epidemics. 641. M185. Ceremonies of the same sort are observed at Midland in Silesia. Thus in many places the grown girls with the help of the young men dress up a straw figure with women's clothes and carry it out of the village, towards the setting sun. At the boundary they strip it of its clothes, tear it in pieces, and scatter the fragments about the fields. This is called burying death. As they carry the image out, they sing that they are about to bury death under an oak, that he may depart from the people. Sometimes the song runs that they are burying death over hill and dale to return no more. In the Polish neighborhood of Gross Strelitz the puppet is called goik. It is carried on horseback and thrown into the nearest water. The people think that the ceremony protects them from sickness of every sort in the coming year. In the districts of Wolau and Garodi, image of death used to be thrown over the boundary of the next village. But as the neighbors feared to receive the ill-omened figure, they were on the lookout to repel it, and hard knocks were often exchanged between the two parties. In some Polish parts of Upper Silesia the effigy representing an old woman, goes by the name of Marzana, the goddess of death. It is made in the house where the last death occurred, and is carried on a pole to the boundary of the village, where it is thrown into a pond or burned. At Polquits the custom of carrying out death fell into abeyance. But an outbreak of fatal sickness which followed the intermission of the ceremony induced the people to resume it. 642. Some of the Moravians of Silesia make 3 puppets on this occasion. One represents a man, another a bride, and the third a bridesmaid. The first is carried by the boys, the 2 last by the girls. Formerly these effigies were torn to pieces at a brook. Now they are brought home again. 643. In this last custom 2 of the figures are clearly conceived as bride and bridegroom. M186. In Bohemia the children go out with a straw man, representing death, to the end of the village, where they burn it, singing, "Now carry we death out of the village, the new summer into the village. Welcome, dear summer, green little corn." 644. At Tabor in Bohemia the figure of death is carried out of the town and flung from a high rock into the water, while they sing, "Death swims on the water, summer will soon be here, we carried death away for you, we brought the summer. And do thou, O holy Marketa, give us a good year, for wheat and for rye." 645. In other parts of Bohemia they carry death to the end of the village, singing, "We carry death out of the village, and the new year into the village. Dear spring, we bid you welcome, green grass, we bid you welcome." Behind the village they erect a pyre, on which they burn the straw figure, reviling and scoffing at it the while. Then they return, singing, "We have carried away death, and brought life back. He has taken up his quarters in the village, therefore sing joyous songs." 646. M187. In some German villages of Moravia, as in Jasnitz and Seidendorf, the young folk assemble on the 3rd Sunday in Lent and fashion a straw man, who is generally adorned with a fur cap and a pair of old leathern hose, if such are to be had. The effigy is then hoisted on a pole, and carried by the lads and lasses out into the open fields. On the way, they sing a song, in which it is said that they are carrying death away, and bringing dear summer into the house, and with summer the May and the flowers. On reaching an appointed place they dance in a circle round the effigy with loud shouts and screams, then suddenly rush at it and tear it to pieces with their hands. Lastly, the pieces are thrown together in a heap, the pole is broken, and fire is set to the whole. While it burns the troop dances merrily round it, rejoicing at the victory won by spring. And, when the fire has nearly died out they go to the householders to beg for a present of eggs wherewith to hold a feast, taking care to give as a reason for the request that they have carried death out and away. 647. M188. The preceding evidence shows that the effigy of death is often regarded with fear and treated with marks of hatred and abhorrence. Thus, the anxiety of the villagers to transfer the figure from their own to their neighbor's land, and the reluctance of the latter to receive the ominous guest, are proof enough of the dread which it inspires. Further, in Lusatia and Silesia the puppet is sometimes made to look in at the window of a house, and it is believed that someone in the house will die within the year unless his life is redeemed by the payment of money. 648. Again, after throwing the effigy away, the bearers sometimes run home lest death should follow them, and if one of them falls in running, it is believed that he will die within the year. 649. At Kradim, in Bohemia, the figure of death is made out of a cross, with the head and mask stuck at the top, and a shirt stretched out on it. On the 5th Sunday in Lent the boys take this effigy to the nearest brook or pool, and standing in a line, throw it into the water. Then they all plunge in after it. But as soon as it is caught no one more may enter the water. The boy who did not enter the water or entered it last will die within the year, and he is obliged to carry the death back to the village. The effigy is then burned. 650. On the other hand, it is believed that no one will die within the year in the house out of which the figure of death has been carried. 651. And the village out of which death has been driven is sometimes supposed to be protected against sickness and plague. 652. In some villages of Austrian Silesia on the Saturday before Dead Sunday an effigy is made of old clothes, hay, and straw, for the purpose of driving death out of the village. On Sunday the people, armed with sticks and straps, assemble before the house where the figure is lodged. 4 lads then draw the effigy by cords through the village amid exultant shouts, while all the others beat it with their sticks and straps. On reaching a field which belongs to a neighboring village they lay down the figure, cudgel it soundly, and scatter the fragments over the field. The people believe that the village from which death has been thus carried out will be safe from any infectious disease for the whole year. 653. In Slavonia the figure of death is cudgeled and then rent in two. 654. In Poland the effigy, made of hemp and straw, is flung into a pool or swamp with the words "The devil, take thee." 655. Section 5. Sawing the old woman. M189. The custom of sawing the old woman, which is or used to be observed in Italy, France, and Spain on the 4th Sunday in Lent, is, doubtless, as Grimm supposes, merely another form of the custom of carrying out death. A great hideous figure representing the oldest woman of the village was dragged out and sawn in two, amid a prodigious noise, made with cowbells, pots and pans, and so forth. 656. In Palermo the representation used to be still more lifelike. At mid-Lent an old woman was drawn through the streets on a cart, attended by 2 men dressed in the costume of the Compagnia de Bianchi, a society or religious order, whose function it was to attend and console prisoners condemned to death. A scaffold was erected in a public square. The old woman mounted it, and 2 mock executioners proceeded, amid a storm of huzzas and hand-clapping, to saw through her neck, or rather through a bladder of blood which had been previously fitted to it. The blood gushed out and the old woman pretended to swoon and die. The last of these mock executions took place in 1737. 657. In Florence, during the 15th and 16th centuries, the old woman was represented by a figure stuffed with walnuts and dried figs and fastened to the top of a ladder. At mid-Lent this effigy was sawn through the middle under the loggia of the Mercato Nuovo, and as the dried fruits tumbled out they were scrambled for by the crowd. A trace of the custom is still to be seen in the practice, observed by urchins, of secretly pinning paper ladders to the shoulders of women of the lower classes who happen to show themselves in the streets on the morning of mid-Lent. 658. A similar custom is observed by urchins in Rome. And at Naples on the 1st of April boys cut strips of cloth into the shape of saws, smear them with gypsum, and strike passers-by with their saws on the back, thus imprinting the figure of a saw upon their clothes. 659. At Montalto, in Calabria, boys go about at mid-Lent with little saws made of cane and jeer at old people, who therefore generally stay indoors on that day. The Calabrian women meet together at this time and feast on figs, chestnuts, honey, and so forth. This they call sawing the old woman, a reminiscence probably of a custom like the old Florentine one. 660. In Lombardy the Thursday of mid-Lent is known as the Day of the Old Wives, Il Giorno del Vecchi. The children run about crying out for the oldest woman, whom they wish to burn. And failing to possess themselves of the original, they make a puppet representing her, which in the evening is consumed on a bonfire. On the Lake of Garda the blaze of light flaring at different points on the hills produces a picturesque effect. 661. M190. In Berry, a region of central France, the custom of sawing the old woman at mid-Lent used to be popular, and has probably not wholly died out even now. Here the name of fairs of the old wives was given to certain fairs held in Lent, at which children were made to believe that they would see the old woman of mid-Lent split or sawn asunder. At Argentan and Cluis Decis, when mid-Lent has come, children of 10 or 12 years of age scour the streets with wooden swords, pursue the old crones whom they meet, and even try to break into the houses where ancient dames are known to live. Passers-by, who see the children thus engaged, say they are going to cut or saber the old woman. Meantime the old wives take care to keep out of sight as much as possible. When the children of Cluas have gone their rounds, and the day draws towards evening, they repair to Cluas, where they mold a rude figure of an old woman out of clay, hew it in pieces with their wooden swords, and throw the bits into the river. At Burgess on the same day, an effigy, representing an old woman, was formally sawn in two on the Crier Stone in a public square. About the middle of the 19th century, in the same town and on the same day, hundreds of children assembled at the hospital to see the old woman split or divided in two. A religious service was held in the building on this occasion, which attracted many idlers. In the streets it was not uncommon to hear cries of "Let us cleave the old wife! Let us cleave the oldest woman of the ward!" At Tull, on the day of Midland, the people used to inquire after the oldest woman in the town, and to tell the children that at midday punctually she was to be sawn in two at Pas St. Clair. 662. M191, in Barcelona on the fourth Sunday in Lent, boys run about the streets, some with saws, others with billets of wood, others again with cloths in which they collect gratuities. They sing a song in which it is said that they are looking for the oldest woman of the city for the purpose of sawing her in two in honor of Midland. At last, pretending to have found her, they saw something in two and burn it. A like custom is found amongst the South Slavs. In Lent the Croats tell their children that at noon an old woman is being sawn in two outside the gates. And in Carniola also the saying is current that at mid-Lent an old woman is taken out of the village and sawn in two. The North Slavonian expression for keeping mid-Lent is Bough, that is, sawing the old wife. 663. In the Graubünden canton of Switzerland, on Invocavit Sunday, grown people used to assemble in the alehouse and there saw in two a straw puppet, which they called Mrs. Winter or the ugly woman, the Gorda, while the children in the streets teased each other with wooden saws. 664. M192. Among the gypsies of southeastern Europe the custom of sawing the old woman in two is observed in a very graphic form, not at Midland, but on the afternoon of Palm Sunday. The old woman, represented by a puppet of straw dressed in women's clothes, is laid across a beam in some open place, and beaten with clubs by the assembled gypsies, after which it is sawn in two by a young man and a maiden, both of whom wear a disguise. While the effigy is being sawn through, the rest of the company dance round it, singing songs of various sorts. The remains of the figure are finally burned, and the ashes thrown into a stream. The ceremony is supposed by the gypsies themselves to be observed in honor of a certain Shadow Queen. Hence Palm Sunday goes by the name Shadow Day among all the strolling gypsies of Eastern and Southern Europe. According to the popular belief, this Shadow Queen, of whom the gypsies of today have only a very vague and confused conception, vanishes underground at the appearance of spring, but comes forth again at the beginning of winter to plague mankind during that inclement season with sickness, hunger, and death. Among the vagrant gypsies of southern Hungary the effigy is regarded as an expiatory and thank offering made to the Shadow Queen for having spared the people during the winter. In Transylvania the gypsies who live in tents clothe the puppet in the cast-off garments of the woman who has last become a widow. The widow herself gives the clothes gladly for this purpose, because she thinks that being burned they will pass into the possession of her departed husband, who will thus have no excuse for returning from the spirit land to visit her. The ashes are thrown by the Transylvanian gypsies on the first graveyard that they pass on their journey. 665. In this gypsy custom the equivalence of the effigy of the old woman to the effigy of death in the customs we have just been considering comes out very clearly, thus strongly confirming the opinion of Grimm that the practice of sawing the old woman is only another form of the practice of carrying out death. M193. The same perhaps may be said of a somewhat different form which the custom assumes in parts of Spain and Italy. In Spain it is sometimes usual, on Ash Wednesday, to fashion an effigy of stucco or pasteboard representing a hideous old woman with 7 legs, wearing a crown of sorrel and spinach, and holding a scepter in her hand. The 7 skinny legs stand for the 7 weeks of the Lenten fast which begins on Ash Wednesday. This monster proclaimed Queen of Lent amid the chanting of lugubrious songs, is carried in triumph through the crowded streets and public places. On reaching the principal square, the people put out their torches, cease shouting, and disperse. Their revels are now ended, and they take a vow to hold no more merry meetings until all the legs of the old woman have fallen one by one and she has been beheaded. The effigy is then deposited in some place appointed for the purpose, where the public is admitted to see it during the whole of Lent. Every week, on Saturday evening, one of the Queen's legs is pulled off. And on Holy Saturday, when from every church tower the joyous clangor of the bells proclaims the glad tidings that Christ is risen, the mutilated body of the fallen Queen is carried, with great solemnity, to the principal square and publicly beheaded. 666. M194, a custom of the same sort prevails in various parts of Italy. Thus, in the Abruzzi they hang a puppet of tow, representing Lent, to a cord, which stretches across the street from one window to another. 7. Feathers are attached to the figure, and in its hand it grasps a distaff and spindle. Every Saturday in Lent one of the 7 feathers is plucked out, and on Holy Saturday, while the bells are ringing, a string of chestnuts is burned for the purpose of sending Lent and its meager fare to the devil. In houses too, it is usual to amuse children by cutting the figure of an old woman with 7 legs out of pasteboard and sticking it beside the chimney. The old woman represents Lent, and her 7 legs are the 7 weeks of the fast. Every Saturday one of the legs is amputated. At mid-Lent the effigy is cut through the middle, and the part of which the feet have been already amputated is removed. Sometimes the figure is stuffed with sweets, dried fruits, and halfpence, for which the street urchins scramble when the puppet is bisected. 667. In the Sorrentine Peninsula, Lent is similarly represented by the effigy of a wrinkled old hag with a spindle and distaff, which is fastened to a balcony or a window. Attached to the figure is an orange with as many feathers stuck into it as there are weeks in Lent, and at the end of each week one of the feathers is plucked out. At mid-Lent the puppet is sawn in two, an operation which is sometimes attended by a gush of blood from a bladder, concealed in the interior of the figure. Any old women who show themselves in the streets on that day are exposed to gibes and jests, and may be warned that they ought to remain at home. 668. At Castellamare, to the south of Naples, an English lady observed a rude puppet dangling from a string which spanned one of the narrow streets of the old town, being fastened at either end, high overhead, to the upper part of the many-storied houses. The puppet, about a foot long, was dressed all in black, rather like a nun, and from the skirts projected 5 or 6 feathers which bore a certain resemblance to legs. A peasant being asked what these things meant, replied with Italian vagueness, "It is only Lent." Further inquiries, however, elicited the information that at the end of every week in Lent one of the feather legs was pulled off the puppet, and that the puppet was finally destroyed on the last day of Lent. 669. Section 6. Ringing in Summer. M195. In the preceding ceremonies the return of spring, summer, or life, as a sequel to the expulsion of death, is only implied or at most announced. In the following ceremonies it is plainly enacted. Thus in some parts of Bohemia the effigy of death is drowned by being thrown into the water at sunset. Then the girls go out into the wood and cut down a young tree with a green crown, hang a doll dressed as a woman on it, deck the whole with green, red, and white ribbons, and march in procession with their lido, Summer, into the village, collecting gifts and singing. Death swims in the water, spring comes to visit us, with eggs that are red, with yellow pancakes. We carry death out of the village, we are carrying summer into the village. 670. In many Silesian villages the figure of death, after being treated with respect, is stripped of its clothes and flung with curses into the water, or torn to pieces in a field. Then the young folk repair to a wood, cut down a small fir tree, peel the trunk, and deck it with festoons of evergreens, paper roses, painted eggshells, motley bits of cloth, and so forth. The tree thus adorned is called Summer or May. Boys carry it from house to house singing appropriate songs and begging for presents. Among their songs is the following. We have carried death out, we are bringing the dear summer back, the summer and the May, and all the flowers gay. Sometimes they also bring back from the wood a prettily adorned figure, which goes by the name of Summer, May, or the bride. In the Polish districts it is called Joanna, the goddess of spring. 671. At Eisenach on the fourth Sunday in Lent, young people used to fasten a straw man, representing death, to a wheel, which they trundled to the top of a hill. Then setting fire to the figure they allowed it and the wheel to roll down the slope. Next they cut a tall fir tree, tricked it out with ribbons, and set it up in the plain. The men then climbed the tree to fetch down the ribbons. 672. In Upper Lusatia the figure of death, made of straw and rags, is dressed in a veil furnished by the last bride and a shirt provided by the house in which the last death took place. Thus, arrayed the figure is stuck on the end of a long pole and carried at full speed by the tallest and strongest girl, while the rest pelt the effigy with sticks and stones. Whoever hits it will be sure to live through the year. In this way death is carried out of the village and thrown into the water or over the boundary of the next village. On their way home each one breaks a green branch and carries it gaily with him till he reaches the village, when he throws it away. Sometimes the young people of the next village, upon whose land the figure has been thrown, run after them and hurl it back, not wishing to have death among them. Hence the two parties occasionally come to blows. 673. M196. In these cases death is represented by the puppet which is thrown away, summer or life by the branches or trees which are brought back. But sometimes a new potency of life seems to be attributed to the image of death itself, and by a kind of resurrection it becomes the instrument of the general revival. Thus in some parts of Lusatia women alone are concerned in carrying out death, and suffer no male to meddle with it. Attired in mourning, which they wore the whole day, they make a puppet of straw, clothe it in a white shirt, and give it a broom in one hand and a scythe in the other. Singing songs and pursued by urchins throwing stones, they carry the puppet to the village boundary, where they tear it in pieces. Then they cut down a fine tree, hang the shirt on it, and carry it home singing. 674. On the Feast of Ascension the Saxons of Brauler, a village of Transylvania, not far from Hermannstadt, observe the ceremony of carrying out death in the following manner. After morning service all the schoolgirls repair to the house of one of their number, and there dress up the death. This is done by tying a threshed-out sheaf of corn into a rough semblance of a head and body, while the arms are simulated by a broomstick thrust through it horizontally. The figure is dressed in the holiday attire of a young peasant woman, with a red hood, silver brooches, and a profusion of ribbons at the arms and breast. The girls bustle at their work, for soon the bells will be ringing to vespers, and the death must be ready in time to be placed at the open window, that all the people may see it on their way to church. When vespers are over, the longed-for moment has come for the first procession with the death to begin. It is a privilege that belongs to the schoolgirls alone. Two of the older girls seize the figure by the arms and walk in front, all the rest follow two and two. Boys may take no part in the procession, but they troop after it, gazing with open-mouthed admiration at the beautiful death. So the procession goes through all the streets of the village, the girls singing the old hymn that begins, Gott mein Vater, dein Lieb, reicht so weit der Himmel ist, to a tune that differs from the ordinary one. When the procession has wound its way through every street, the girls go to another house, and, having shut the door against the eager prying crowd of boys who follow at their heels, they strip the death and pass the naked truss of straw out of the window to the boys, who pound on it, run out of the village with it, without singing, and fling the dilapidated effigy into the neighboring brook. This done, the second scene of the little drama begins. While the boys were carrying away the death out of the village, the girls remained in the house, and one of them is now dressed in all the finery which had been worn by the effigy. Thus arrayed she is led in procession through all the streets to the singing of the same hymn as before. When the procession is over they all betake themselves to the house of the girl who played the leading part. Here a feast awaits them from which also the boys are excluded. It is a popular belief that the children may safely begin to eat gooseberries and other fruit after the day on which death hath thus been carried out. For death, which up to that time lurked especially in gooseberries, is now destroyed. Further, they may now bathe with impunity out of doors. 675. Very similar is the ceremony which, down to recent years, was observed in some of the German villages of Moravia. Boys and girls met on the afternoon of the first Sunday after Easter, and together fashioned a puppet of straw to represent death. Decked with bright-colored ribbons and cloth, and fastened to the top of a long pole, the effigy was then borne with singing and clamor to the nearest height, where it was stripped of its gay attire and thrown or rolled down this slope. One of the girls was next dressed in the gauze taken from the effigy of death, and with her at its head the procession moved back to the village. In some villages the practice is to bury the effigy in the place that has the most evil reputation of all the countryside, others throw it into running water. 676. M197, in the lusation ceremony described above, 677, the tree which is brought home after the destruction of the figure of death is plainly equivalent to the trees or branches which, in the preceding customs, were brought back as representatives of summer or life, after death had been thrown away or destroyed. But the transference of the shirt worn by the effigy of death to the tree clearly indicates that the tree is a kind of revivification, in a new form, of the destroyed effigy. 678. This comes out also in the Transylvanian and Moravian customs, the dressing of a girl in the clothes worn by the death, and the leading her about the village to the same song which had been sung when the death was being carried about, show that she is intended to be a kind of resuscitation of the being whose effigy has just been destroyed. These examples therefore suggest that the death whose demolition is represented in these ceremonies cannot be regarded as the purely destructive agent which we understand by death. If the tree which is brought back as an embodiment of the reviving vegetation of spring is clothed in the shirt worn by the death which has just been destroyed, the object certainly cannot be to check and counteract the revival of vegetation, it can only be to foster and promote it. Therefore, the being which has just been destroyed, the so-called death, must be supposed to be endowed with a vivifying and quickening influence, which it can communicate to the vegetable and even the animal world. This ascription of a life-giving virtue to the figure of death is put beyond a doubt by the custom, observed in some places, of taking pieces of the straw effigy of death and placing them in the fields to make the crops grow, or in the manger to make the cattle thrive. Thus in Spackendorf, a village of Austrian Silesia, the figure of death, made of straw, brushwood, and rags, is carried with wild songs to an open place outside the village and there burned, and while it is burning a general struggle takes place for the pieces, which are pulled out of the flames with bare hands. Each one who secures a fragment of the effigy ties it to a branch of the largest tree in his garden, or buries it in his field, in the belief that this causes the crops to grow better. 679. In the Troppau district of Austrian Silesia, the straw figure which the boys make on the fourth Sunday in Lent is dressed by the girls in women's clothes and hung with ribbons, necklace, and garlands. Attached to a long pole it is carried out of the village, followed by a troop of young people of both sexes, who alternately frolic, lament, and sing songs. Arrived at its destination, a field outside the village, the figure is stripped of its clothes and ornaments. Then the crowd rushes at it and tears it to bits, scuffling for the fragments. Everyone tries to get a wisp of the straw of which the effigy was made, because such a wisp, placed in the manger, is believed to make the cattle thrive. 680. Or the straw is put in the hen's nest, it being supposed that this prevents the hens from carrying away their eggs, and makes them brood much better. 681. The same attribution of a fertilizing power to the figure of death appears in the belief that if the bearers of the figure, after throwing it away, beat cattle with their sticks, this will render the beasts fat or prolific. 682. Perhaps the sticks had been previously used to beat the death. 683, and so had acquired the fertilizing power ascribed to the effigy. We have seen too that at Leipzig a straw effigy of death was shewn to young wives to make them fruitful. 684. M198. It seems hardly possible to separate from the May trees the trees, or branches which are brought into the village after the destruction of the death. The bearers who bring them in profess to be bringing in the summer. 685. Therefore the trees obviously represent the summer. Indeed in Silesia they are commonly called the summer or the May. 686. And the doll, which is sometimes attached to the summer tree, is a duplicate, representative of the summer, just as the May is sometimes represented at the same time by a May tree and a May lady. 687. Further, the summer trees are adorned like May trees with ribbons and so on. Like May trees, when large, they are planted in the ground and climbed up. And like May trees, when small, they are carried from door to door by boys or girls singing songs and collecting money. 688. And as if to demonstrate the identity of the two sets of customs, the bearers of the summer tree sometimes announce that they are bringing in the summer and the May. 689. The customs, therefore, of bringing in the May and bringing in the summer are essentially the same. And the summer tree is merely another form of the May tree, the only distinction, besides that of name, being in the time at which they are respectively brought in. For while the May tree is usually fetched in on the 1st of May or at Whitsuntide, the summer tree is fetched in on the 4th Sunday in Lent. Therefore, if the May tree is an embodiment of the tree spirit or spirit of vegetation, the summer tree must likewise be an embodiment of the tree spirit or spirit of vegetation. But we have seen that the summer tree is in some cases a revivification of the effigy of death. It follows, therefore, that in these cases the effigy, called death, must be an embodiment of the tree spirit or spirit of vegetation. This inference is confirmed, first, by the vivifying and fertilizing influence which the fragments of the effigy of death are believed to exercise both on vegetable and on animal life. 690. For this influence, as we saw in the first part of this work, 691, is supposed to be a special attribute of the tree spirit. It is confirmed, secondly, by observing that the effigy of death is sometimes decked with leaves or made of twigs, branches, hemp, or a threshed-out sheaf of corn. 692, and that sometimes it is hung on a little tree and so carried about by girls collecting money. 693, just as is done with the May tree and the May lady, and with the summer tree and the doll attached to it. In short, we are driven to regard the expulsion of death and the bringing in of summer as, in some cases at least, merely another form of that death and revival of the spirit of vegetation in spring which we saw enacted in the killing and resurrection of the wild man. 694. The burial and resurrection of the carnival is probably another way of expressing the same idea. The interment of the representative of the carnival under a dung heap, 695, is natural, if he is supposed to possess a quickening and fertilizing influence like that ascribed to the effigy of death. The Esthonians, indeed, who carry the straw figure out of the village in the usual way on Shrove Tuesday, do not call it the carnival, but the wood spirit, Metzig, and they clearly indicate the identity of the effigy with the wood spirit by fixing it to the top of a tree in the wood, where it remains for a year, and is besought almost daily with prayers and offerings to protect the herds. For like a true wood spirit, the Metzig is a patron of cattle. Sometimes the Metzig is made of sheaves of corn. 696. M199. Thus we may fairly conjecture that the names carnival, death, and summer are comparatively late and inadequate expressions for the beings personified or embodied in the customs with which we have been dealing. The very abstractness of the names bespeaks a modern origin. For the personification of times and seasons like the carnival and summer, or of an abstract notion like death, is hardly primitive. But the ceremonies themselves bear the stamp of a dateless antiquity. Therefore we can hardly help supposing that in their origin the ideas which they embodied were of a more simple and concrete order. The notion of a tree, perhaps of a particular kind of tree, for some savages have no word for tree in general, or even of an individual tree, is sufficiently concrete to supply a basis from which by a gradual process of generalization the wider idea of a spirit of vegetation might be reached. But this general idea of vegetation would readily be confounded with the season in which it manifests itself. Hence the substitution of spring, summer, or May for the tree spirit or spirit of vegetation would be easy and natural. Again, the concrete notion of the dying tree or dying vegetation would by a similar process of generalization glide into a notion of death in general. So that the practice of carrying out the dying or dead vegetation in spring, as a preliminary to its revival, would in time widen out into an attempt to banish death in general from the village or district. The view that in these spring ceremonies death meant originally the dying or dead vegetation of winter has the high support of W. Mannard. And he confirms it by the analogy of the name death as applied to the spirit of the ripe corn. Commonly the spirit of the ripe corn is conceived, not as dead, but as old, and hence it goes by the name of the old man or the old woman. But, in some places the last sheaf cut at harvest, which is generally believed to be the seat of the corn spirit, is called the dead one. Children are warned against entering the cornfields because death sits in the corn. And, in a game played by Saxon children in Transylvania at the maize harvest, death is represented by a child completely covered with maize leaves. 697. Section 7. Battle of Summer and Winter. M200. Sometimes in the popular customs of the peasantry the contrast between the dormant powers of vegetation in winter and their awakening vitality in spring takes the form of a dramatic contest between actors who play the parts respectively of winter and summer. Thus in the towns of Sweden on May Day 2 troops of young men on horseback used to meet as if for mortal combat. One of them was led by a representative of winter clad in furs, who threw snowballs and ice in order to prolong the cold weather. The other troop was commanded by a representative of summer covered with fresh leaves and flowers. In the sham fight which followed the party of summer came off victorious, and the ceremony ended with a feast. 698. Again, in the region of the Middle Rhine, a representative of summer clad in ivy combats a representative of winter clad in straw or moss and finally gains a victory over him. The vanquished foe is thrown to the ground and stripped of his casing of straw, which is torn to pieces and scattered about, while the youthful comrades of the two champions sing a song to commemorate the defeat of winter by summer. Afterwards they carry about a summer garland or branch and collect gifts of eggs and bacon from house to house. Sometimes the champion who acts the part of summer is dressed in leaves and flowers and wears a chaplet of flowers on his head. In the Palatinate this mimic conflict takes place on the fourth Sunday in Lent. 699. All over Bavaria the same drama used to be acted on the same day, and it was still kept up in some places down to the middle of the 19th century or later. While summer appeared clad all in green, decked with fluttering ribbons, and carrying a branch in blossom or a little tree hung with apples and pears, winter was muffled up in cap and mantle of fur and bore in his hand a snow shovel or a flail. Accompanied by their respective retinues dressed in corresponding attire, they went through all the streets of the village, halting before the houses and singing staves of old songs, for which they received presents of bread, eggs, and fruit. Finally, after a short struggle, winter was beaten by summer and ducked in the village well or driven out of the village with shouts and laughter into the forest. 700. In some parts of Bavaria the boys who play the parts of winter and summer act their little drama in every house that they visit, and engage in a war of words before they come to blows, each of them vaunting the pleasures and benefits of the season he represents and disparaging those of the other. The dialogue is in verse. A few couplets may serve as specimens. Summer. Green, green are meadows wherever I pass, and the mowers are busy among the grass. Winter white, white are the meadows wherever I go, and the sledges glide hissing across the snow. Summer. I'll climb up the tree where the red cherries glow, and winter can stand by himself down below. Winter. With you I will climb the cherry tree tall, its branches will kindle the fire in the hall. Summer. O winter, you are most uncivil, to send old women to the devil. Winter. By that I make them warm and mellow, so let them bawl and let them bellow. Summer. I am the summer in what array, I'm chasing the winter far, far away. Winter. I am the winter in mantle of furs, I'm chasing the summer o'er bushes and burrs. Summer. Just say a word more, and I'll have you banned, at once and forever from Summerland. Winter. Oh summer, for all your bluster and brag, you'd not dare to carry a hen in a bag. Summer. Oh winter, your chatter no more can I stay, I'll kick and I'll cuff you without delay. Here ensues a scuffle between the two little boys, in which summer gets the best of it and turns winter out of the house. But soon the beaten champion of winter peeps in at the door and says with a humbled and crestfallen air, "Oh summer, dear summer, I'm under your ban, for you are the master and I am the man." To which summer replies, "'Tis a capital notion, an excellent plan, if I am the master and you are the man. So come, my dear winter, and give me your hand, we'll travel together to Summerland." 701. M201, at Gofritz in Lower Austria, two men personating summer and winter used to go from house to house on Shrove Tuesday, and were everywhere welcomed by the children with great delight. The representative of summer was clad in white and bore a sickle. His comrade, who played the part of winter, had a fur cap on his head, his arms and legs were swathed in straw, and he carried a flail. In every house they sang verses, alternately. 702. At Dromling in Brunswick, down to the present time, the contest between summer and winter is acted every year at Whitsuntide by a troop of boys and a troop of girls. The boys rush singing, shouting, and ringing bells from house to house to drive winter away. After them come the girls singing softly and led by a May bride, all in bright dresses and decked with flowers and garlands to represent the genial advent of spring. Formerly the part of winter was played by a straw man which the boys carried with them. Now it is acted by a real man in disguise. 703. In Wachtel and Brodeck, a German village and a little German town of Moravia, encompassed by Slavonic people on every side, the great change that comes over the earth in spring is still annually mimicked. The long village of Wachtel, with its trim houses and farmyards, nestles in a valley surrounded by pretty pine woods. Here, on a day in spring, about the time of the vernal equinox, an elderly man with a long flaxen beard may be seen going from door to door. He is muffled in furs, with warm gloves on his hands, and a bearskin cap on his head, and he carries a threshing flail. This is the personification of winter. With him goes a younger beardless man, dressed in white, wearing a straw hat trimmed with gay ribbons on his head, and carrying a decorated May tree in his hands. This is summer. At every house they receive a friendly greeting and recite a long dialogue in verse, winter punctuating his discourse with his flail, which he brings down with rude vigor on the backs of all within reach. 704. Amongst the Slavonic population near Ungarisch Broad, in Moravia, the ceremony took a somewhat different form. Girls dressed in green marched in procession round a May tree. Then two others, one in white and one in green, stepped up to the tree and engaged in a dialogue. Finally, the girl in white was driven away, but returned afterwards clothed in green, and the festival ended with dance. 705. M202. On May Day it used to be customary in almost all the large parishes of the Isle of Man to choose from among the daughters of the wealthiest farmers a young maiden to be Queen of May. She was dressed in the gast attire and attended by about 20 others, who were called maids of honor. She had also a young man for her captain with a number of inferior officers under him. In opposition to her was the Queen of Winter, a man, attired as a woman, with woolen hoods, fur tippets, and loaded with the warmest and heaviest clothes, one upon another. Her attendants were habited in like manner, and she too had a captain and troop for her defense. Thus representing respectively the beauty of spring and the deformity of winter, they set forth from their different quarters, the one preceded by the dulcet music of flutes and violins, the other by the harsh clatter of cleavers and tongs. In this array they marched till they met on a common, where the trains of the two mimic sovereigns engaged in a mock battle. If the Queen of Winter's forces got the better of their adversaries and took her rival prisoner, the captive Queen of Summer was ransomed for as much as would pay the expenses of the festival. After this ceremony, Winter and her company retired and diverted themselves in a barn, while the partisans of Summer danced on the green, concluding the evening with a feast, at which the Queen and her maids sat at one table, and the captain and his troop at another. In later times the person of the Queen of May was exempt from capture, but one of her slippers was substituted and, if captured, had to be ransomed to defray the expenses of the pageant. The procession of the Summer, which was subsequently composed of little girls and called the Makeboard, outlived that of its rival the Winter for some years. But both have now long been things of the past. 706. M203. Among the Central Esquimaux of North America, the contest between representatives of Summer and Winter, which in Europe has long degenerated into a mere dramatic performance, is still kept up as a magical ceremony, of which the avowed intention is to influence the weather. In autumn, when storms announce the approach of the dismal Arctic winter, the Esquimaux divide themselves into two parties called respectively the Ptarmigans and the Ducks, the Ptarmigans comprising all persons born in winter, and the Ducks all persons born in summer. A long rope of sealskin is then stretched out, and each party laying hold of one end of it seeks by tugging with might and main to drag the other party over to its side. If the Ptarmigans get the worst of it, then Summer has won the game and fine weather may be expected to prevail through the winter. 707. In this ceremony it is clearly assumed that persons born in summer have a natural affinity with warm weather, and therefore possess a power of mitigating the rigor of winter, whereas persons born in winter are, so to say, of a cold and frosty disposition and can thereby exert a refrigerating influence on the temperature of the air. In spite of this natural antipathy between the representatives of summer and winter, we may be allowed to conjecture that in the grand tug-of-war the Ptarmigans do not pull at the rope with the same hearty goodwill as the Ducks, and that thus the genial influence of summer commonly prevails over the harsh austerity of winter. The Indians of Canada seem also to have imagined that persons are endowed with distinct natural capacities according as they are born in summer or winter, and they turn the distinction to account in much the same fashion as the Esquimaux. When they wearied of the long frosts and the deep snow which kept them prisoners in their huts and prevented them from hunting, all of them who were born in summer rushed out of their houses armed with burning brands and torches which they hurled against the one who makes winter. And this was supposed to produce the desired effect of mitigating the cold. But those Indians who were born in winter abstained from taking part in the ceremony, for they believed that if they meddled with it the cold would increase instead of diminishing. 708. We may surmise that in the corresponding European ceremonies, which have just been described, it was formally deemed necessary that the actors, who played the parts of winter and summer, should have been born in the seasons which they personated. M204. Every year on the Monday after the spring equinox boys and girls, attired in gay costume flock at a very early hour into Zurich from the country. The girls, generally clad in white, are called Marialis and carry two and two a small May tree or a wreath decked with flowers and ribbons. Thus they go in bands from house to house, jingling the bells, which are attached to the wreath and singing a song, in which it is said that the Marialis dance because the leaves on the grass are green and everything is bursting into blossom. In this way they are supposed to celebrate the triumph of summer and to proclaim his coming. The boys are called Bough. They generally wear over their ordinary clothes a shirt, decked with many-colored ribbons, tall pointed paper caps on their heads, and masks before their faces. In this quaint costume they cart about through the streets effigies made of straw and other combustible materials, which are supposed to represent winter. At evening these effigies are burned in various parts of the city. 709. The ceremony was witnessed at Zurich on Monday, April 20, 1903, by my friend Dr. J. Sutherland Black, who has kindly furnished me with some notes on the subject. The effigy of winter was a gigantic figure composed in great part, as it seemed, of cotton wool. This was laid on a huge pyre, about 30 feet high, which had been erected on the Stadthaus close to the lake. In presence of a vast concourse of people fire was set to the pyre and all was soon in a blaze, while the town bells rang a joyous peal. As the figure gradually consumed in the flames, the mechanism enclosed in its interior produced a variety of grotesque effects, such as the gushing forth of bells. At last, nothing remained of the effigy but the iron backbone. The crowd slowly dispersed, and the fire brigade set to work to quench the smoldering embers. 710. In this ceremony the contest between summer and winter is rather implied than expressed, but the significance of the rite is unmistakable. Section 8. Death and Resurrection of Kostrubonko. M205. In Russia, funeral ceremonies like those of burying the carnival and carrying out death are celebrated under the names, not of death or the carnival, but of certain mythic figures, Kostrubonko, Kostroma, Kapalo, Lada, and Urolo. These Russian ceremonies are observed both in spring and at midsummer. Thus in Little Russia it used to be the custom, at Eastertide, to celebrate the funeral of a being called Kostrubonko, the deity of the spring. A circle was formed of singers who moved slowly around a girl who lay on the ground as if dead, and as they went they sang, "Dead, dead is our Kostrubonko. Dead, dead is our dear one," until the girl suddenly sprang up, on which the chorus joyfully exclaimed, come to life as our Kostrubonko. Come to life as our dear one." 711. On the eve of St. John, Midsummer Eve, a figure of Kapalo is made of straw, and is dressed in woman's clothes, with a necklace and a floral crown. Then a tree is felled, and, after being decked with ribbons, is set up on some chosen spot. Near this tree, to which they give the name of Marena, winter or death, this straw figure is placed, together with a table, on which stand spirits and viands. Afterwards a bonfire is lit, and the young men and maidens jump over it in couples, carrying the figure with them. On the next day they strip the tree and the figure of their ornaments, and throw them both into a stream. 712. On St. Peter's Day, the 29th of June, or on the following Sunday, the funeral of Kostroma or of Lada, or of Urolo is celebrated in Russia. In the governments of Penza and Simbirsk the funeral used to be represented as follows. A bonfire was kindled on the 28th of June, and on the next day the maidens chose one of their number to play the part of Kostroma. Her companions saluted her with deep obeisances, placed her on a board, and carried her to the bank of a stream. There they bathed her in the water, while the oldest girl made a basket of lime tree bark and beat it like a drum. Then they returned to the village and ended the day with processions, games, and dances. 713. In the Murom district Kostroma was represented by a straw figure dressed in women's clothes and flowers. This was laid in a trough, and carried with songs to the bank of a lake or river. Here the crowd divided into two sides, of which the one attacked and the other defended the figure. At last the assailants gained the day, stripped the figure of its dress and ornaments, tore it in pieces, trod the straw of which it was made underfoot, and flung it into the stream. While the defenders of the figure hid their faces in their hands and pretended to bewail the death of Kostroma. 714. In the district of Kostroma the burial of Urolo was celebrated on the 29th or 30th of June. The people chose an old man and gave him a small coffin containing a purpose-like figure, representing Urolo. This he carried out of the town, followed by women, chanting dirges and expressing by their gestures grief and despair. In the open fields a grave was dug, and into it the figure was lowered amid weeping and wailing, after which games and dances were begun, calling to mind the funeral games celebrated in old times by the pagan Slavonians. 715. In Little Russia the figure of Urolo was laid in a coffin and carried through the streets after sunset surrounded by drunken women, who kept repeating mournfully, "He is dead. He is dead." The men lifted and shook the figure as if they were trying to recall the dead man to life. Then they said to the women, "Women, weep not. I know what is sweeter than honey." But the women continued to lament and chant, as they do at funerals. Of what was he guilty? He was so good. He will arise no more. Oh, how shall we part from thee? What is life without thee? arise, if only for a brief hour. But he rises not, he rises not. At last the Yarolo was buried in a grave. 716. Section 9. Death and revival of vegetation. M206. These Russian customs are plainly of the same nature as those which, in Austria and Germany, are known as carrying out death. Therefore, if the interpretation here adopted of the latter is right, the Russian, Kostrubonko, Yarlo, and the rest must also have been originally embodiments of the spirit of vegetation, and their death must have been regarded as a necessary preliminary to their revival. The revival as a sequel to the death is enacted in the first of the ceremonies described, the death and resurrection of Kostrubonko. The reason why in some of these Russian ceremonies the death of the spirit of vegetation is celebrated at midsummer may be that the decline of summer is dated from Midsummer Day, after which the days begin to shorten, and the sun sets out on his downward journey to the darksome hollows where the frosts of winter lie. Such a turning point of the year, when vegetation might be thought to share the incipient though still almost imperceptible decay of summer, might very well be chosen by primitive man as a fit moment for resorting to those magic rites by which he hopes to stay the decline, or at least to ensure the revival of plant life. M207. But while the death of vegetation appears to have been represented in all, and its revival in some, of these spring and midsummer ceremonies, there are features in some of them which can hardly be explained on this hypothesis alone. The solemn funeral, the lamentations, and the mourning attire, which often characterize these rites, are indeed appropriate at the death of the beneficent spirit of vegetation. But what shall we say of the glee with which the effigy is often carried out, of the sticks and stones with which it is assailed, and the taunts and curses which are hurled at it? What shall we say of the dread of the effigy evinced by the haste with which the bearers scamper home as soon as they have thrown it away, and by the belief that someone must soon die in any house into which it has looked? This dread might perhaps be explained by a belief that there is a certain infectiousness in the dead spirit of vegetation, which renders its approach dangerous. But this explanation, besides being rather strained, does not cover the rejoicings which often attend the carrying out of death. We must therefore recognize two distinct and seemingly opposite features in these ceremonies: on the one hand, sorrow for the death, and affection and respect for the dead; on the other hand, fear and hatred of the dead, and rejoicings at his death. How the former of these features is to be explained I have attempted to show. How the latter came to be so closely associated with the former is a question which I shall try to answer in the sequel. M208. Before we quit these European customs to go farther afield, it will be well to notice that occasionally the expulsion of death or of a mythic being is conducted without any visible representative of the personage expelled. Thus at Königstein, near Görlitz and Silesia, all the villagers, young and old, used to go out with straw torches to the top of a neighboring hill, called Totenstein, Deathstone, where they lit their torches, and so returned home singing, "We have driven out death, we are bringing back summer." 717. In Albania young people light torches of resinous wood on Easter Eve, and march in procession through the village, brandishing them. At last they throw the torches into the river, saying, "Ha, Kor, we fling you into the river, light these torches, that you may return no more." Some say that the intention of the ceremony is to drive out winter. But Kor is conceived as a malignant being who devours children. 718. Section 10. Analogous rites in India. M209. In the Kanagra district of India there is a custom observed by young girls in spring which closely resembles some of the European spring ceremonies just described. It is called the Raleigh Kamala, or Fair of Raleigh, the Raleigh being a small painted earthen image of Shiva or Parvati. The custom is in vogue all over the Kanagra district, and its celebration, which is entirely confined to young girls, lasts through most of Chet, March-April, up to the Sankrant of Baisakh, April. On a morning in March, all the young girls of the village take small baskets of dove grass and flowers to an appointed place, where they throw them in a heap. Round this heap they stand in a circle and sing. This goes on every day for 10 days, till the heap of grass and flowers has reached a fair height. Then they cut in the jungle 2 branches, each with 3 prongs at one end, and place them, prongs downwards, over the heap of flowers, so as to make 2 tripods or pyramids. On the single uppermost points of these branches they get an image maker to construct 2 clay images, one to represent Siva, and the other Parvati. The girls then divide themselves into 2 parties, one for Siva and one for Parvati, and marry the images in the usual way, leaving out no part of the ceremony. After the marriage they have a feast, the cost of which is defrayed by contributions solicited from their parents. Then at the next Sankrant, Baisakh, they all go together to the riverside, throw the images into a deep pool, and weep over the place, as though they were to performing funeral obsequies. The boys of the neighborhood often tease them by diving after the images, bringing them up, and waving them about while the girls are crying over them. The object of the fair is said to be to secure a good husband. 719. M210, that in this Indian ceremony the deities Siva and Parvati are conceived as spirits of vegetation seems to be proved by the placing of their images on branches over a heap of grass and flowers. Here, as often, in European folk custom, the divinities of vegetation are represented in duplicate, by plants and by puppets. The marriage of these Indian deities in spring corresponds to the European ceremonies in which the marriage of the vernal spirits of vegetation is represented by the king and queen of May, the May bride, bridegroom of the May, and so forth. 720. The throwing of the images into the water, and the mourning for them, are the equivalents of the European customs of throwing the dead spirit of vegetation under the name of death, Yerlo, Kostroma, and the rest, into the water and lamenting over it. Again, in India, as often in Europe, the rite is performed exclusively by females. The notion that the ceremony helps to procure husbands for the girls can be explained by the quickening and fertilizing influence which the spirit of vegetation is believed to exert upon the life of man as well as of plants. 721. Section 11. The Magic Spring. M211. The general explanation which we have been led to adopt of these, and many similar ceremonies is that they are, or were in their origin, magical rites intended to ensure the revival of nature in spring. The means by which they were supposed to effect this end were imitation and sympathy. Led astray by his ignorance of the true causes of things, primitive man believed that in order to produce the great phenomena of nature on which his life depended he had only to imitate them, and that, immediately by a secret sympathy or mystic influence the little drama, which he acted in forest glade or mountain dell, on desert plain or wind-swept shore, would be taken up and repeated by mightier actors on a vaster stage. He fancied that by masquerading in leaves and flowers he helped the bare earth to clothe herself with verdure, and that by playing the death and burial of winter he drove that gloomy season away, and made smooth the path for the footsteps of returning spring. If we find it hard to throw ourselves even in fancy into a mental condition in which such things seem possible, we can more easily picture to ourselves the anxiety which the savage, when he first began to lift his thoughts above the satisfaction of his merely animal wants, and to meditate on the causes of things, may have felt as to the continued operation of what we now call the laws of nature. To us, familiar as we are with the conception of the uniformity and regularity with which the great cosmic phenomena succeed each other, there seems little ground for apprehension that the causes which produce these effects will cease to operate, at least within the near future. But this confidence in the stability of nature is bred only by the experience which comes of wide observation and long tradition. And the savage, with its narrow sphere of observation and his short-lived tradition, lacks the very elements of that experience which alone could set his mind at rest in face of the ever-changing and often menacing aspects of nature. No wonder, therefore, that he is thrown into a panic by an eclipse, and thinks that the sun or the moon would surely perish, if he did not raise a clamor and shoot his puny shafts into the air to defend the luminaries from the monster who threatens to devour them. No wonder he is terrified when in the darkness of night a streak of sky is suddenly illumined by the flash of a meteor, or the whole expanse of the celestial arch glows with the fitful light of the northern streamers. 722. Even phenomena which recur at fixed and uniform intervals may be viewed by him with apprehension, before he has come to recognize the orderliness of their recurrence. The speed or slowness of his recognition of such periodic or cyclic changes in nature will depend largely on the length of the particular cycle. The cycle, for example, of day and night is, everywhere, except in the polar regions, so short and hence so frequent, that men probably soon cease to discompose themselves seriously as to the chance of its failing to recur, though the ancient Egyptians, as we have seen, daily wrought enchantments to bring back to the east in the morning the fiery orb which had sunk at evening in the crimson west. But it was far otherwise with the annual cycle of the seasons. To any man a year is a considerable period, seeing that the number of our years is but few at the best. To the primitive savage, with his short memory and imperfect means of marking the flight of time, a year may well have been so long that he failed to recognize it as a cycle at all, and watched the changing aspects of earth and heaven with a perpetual wonder, alternately delighted and alarmed, elated and cast down, according as the vicissitudes of light and heat, of plant and animal life, ministered to his comfort or threatened his existence. In autumn, when the withered leaves were whirled about the forest by the nipping blast, and he looked up at the bare boughs, could he feel sure that they would ever be green again? As day by day the sun sank lower and lower in the sky, could he be certain that the luminary would ever retrace his heavenly road? Even the waning moon, whose pale sickle rose thinner and thinner every night over the rim of the eastern horizon, may have excited in his mind a fear lest, when it had wholly vanished, there should be moons no more. M212. These and 1,000 such misgivings may have thronged the fancy, and troubled the peace of the man who first began to reflect on the mysteries of the world he lived in, and to take thought for a more distant future than the morrow. It was natural, therefore, that with such thoughts and fears he should have done all that in him lay to bring back the faded blossom to the bough, to swing the low sun of winter up to his old place in the summer sky, and to restore its orbed fullness to the silver lamp of the waning moon. We may smile at his vain endeavors if we please, but it was only by making a long series of experiments, of which some were almost inevitably doomed to failure, that man learned from experience the futility of some of his attempted methods and the fruitfulness of others. After all, magical ceremonies are nothing but experiments which have failed and which continue to be repeated merely because, for reasons which have already been indicated, 723, the operator is unaware of their failure. With the advance of knowledge, these ceremonies either cease to be performed altogether or are kept up from force of habit long after the intention with which they were instituted has been forgotten. Thus fallen from their high estate, no longer regarded as solemn rites on the punctual performance of which the welfare and even the life of the community depend, they sink gradually to the level of simple pageants, mummeries, and pastimes, till in the final stage of degeneration they are wholly abandoned by older people, and, from having once been the most serious occupation of the sage, become at last the idle sport of children. It is in this final stage of decay that most of the old magical rites of our European forefathers linger on at the present day, and even from this, their last retreat, they are fast being swept away by the rising tide of those multitudinous forces, moral, intellectual, and social, which are bearing mankind onward to a new and unknown goal. We may feel some natural regret at the disappearance of quaint customs and picturesque ceremonies, which have preserved to an age often deemed dull and prosaic something of the flavor and freshness of the olden time, some breath of the springtime of the world. Yet our regret will be lessened when we remember that these pretty pageants, these now innocent diversions, had their origin in ignorance and superstition. That if they are a record of human endeavor, they are also a monument of fruitless ingenuity, of wasted labor, and of blighted hopes. And that for all their gay trappings, their flowers, their ribbons, and their music, they partake far more of tragedy than of farce. M213, the interpretation which, following in the footsteps of W. Maynard, I have attempted to give of these ceremonies has been not a little confirmed by the discovery, made since this book was first written, that the natives of Central Australia regularly practice magical ceremonies for the purpose of awakening the dormant energies of nature at the approach of what may be called the Australian spring. Nowhere, apparently, are the alternations of the seasons more sudden and the contrasts between them more striking than in the deserts of Central Australia, where at the end of a long period of drought the sandy and stony wilderness, over which the silence and desolation of death appear to brood, is suddenly, after a few days of torrential rain, transformed into a landscape smiling with verdure and peopled with teeming multitudes of insects and lizards, of frogs and birds. The marvelous change which passes over the face of nature at such times has been compared even by European observers to the effect of magic. 724. No wonder, then, that the savage should regard it as such an very deed. Now it is just when there is promise of the approach of a good season that the natives of Central Australia are wont especially to perform those magical ceremonies of which the avowed intention is to multiply the plants and animals they use as food. 725. These ceremonies, therefore, present a close analogy to the spring customs of our European peasantry, not only in the time of their celebration, but also in their aim. For we can hardly doubt that in instituting rites designed to assist the revival of plant life in spring, our primitive forefathers were moved, not by any sentimental wish to smell at early violets, or pluck the red primrose, or watch yellow daffodils dancing in the breeze, but by the very practical consideration, certainly not formulated in abstract terms, that the life of man is inextricably bound up with that of plants, and that if they were to perish he could not survive. And as the faith of the Australian savage in the efficacy of his magic rites is confirmed by observing that their performance is invariably followed, sooner or later, by that increase of vegetable and animal life, which it is their object to produce, so, we may suppose, it was with European savages in the olden time. The sight of the fresh green and brake and thicket, of vernal flowers blowing on mossy banks, of swallows arriving from the south, and of the sun mounting daily higher in the sky, would be welcomed by them as so many visible signs that their enchantments were indeed taking effect, and would inspire them with a cheerful confidence that all was well with the world which they could thus mold to suit their wishes. Only in autumn days, as summer slowly faded, would their confidence again be dashed by doubts and misgivings at symptoms of decay, which told how vain were all their efforts to stave off forever the approach of winter and of death. Note a Chinese indifference to death. M214. Lord Avebury kindly allows me to print the letter of Mr. M.W. Lamson, referred to above, p. 146, Note 1. It runs as follows. Foreign Office, August 7, 1903. Dear Lord Avebury, as a result of enquiries I hear from a Mr. Eames, a lawyer who practiced for some years at Shanghai and has considerable knowledge of Chinese matters, that for a small sum a substitute can be found for execution. This is recognized by the Chinese authorities, with certain exceptions, as for instance, parricide. It is even asserted that the local Tea-Tai gains pecuniarily by this arrangement, as he is as a rule not above obtaining a substitute for the condemned man for a less sum than was paid him by the latter. It is, I believe, part of the doctrine of Confucius that it is one of the highest virtues to increase the family prosperity at the expense of personal suffering. According to Eames, the Chinaman looks upon execution in another man's stead in this light, and consequently there is quite a competition for such a substitution. Should you wish to get more definite information, the address is W. Eames, Esq., Co. Norman Craig, Inner Temple, E.C. The only man in this department who has actually been out to China is at present away. But on his return I will ask him about it. Yours sincerely, Miles W. Lamson. M215. On this subject Lord Avebury had stated, it is said that in China, if a rich man is condemned to death, he can sometimes purchase a willing substitute at a very small expense. 726. In regard to his authority for this statement Lord Avebury wrote to me, August 10, 1903, I believe my previous information came from Sir T. Wade, but I have been unable to lay my hand on his letter, and do not therefore like to state it as a fact. Sir Thomas Wade was English ambassador at Peking, and afterwards professor of Chinese at Cambridge. M216. On the same subject, Mr. Valentine Kyrall, editor of the Foreign Department of the Times, wrote to me as follows. Queen Anne's Mansions, Westminster, SW, August 21, 1905. Dear Sir, I shall be very glad to do what I can to obtain for you the information you require. It was a surprise to me to hear that the accuracy of the statement was called in question. It is certainly a matter of common report in China that the practice exists. The difficulty, I conceive, will be to obtain evidence enabling one to quote concrete cases. My own impression is that the practice is quite justifiable according to Chinese ethics when life is given up from motives of filial piety, that is to say in order to relieve the wants of indigent parents, or to defray the costs of ancestral rites. Your general thesis that life is less valued and more readily sacrificed by some races than by modern Europeans seems to be beyond dispute. Surely the Japanese practice of seppuku, or harakiri, as it is vulgarly called, is a case in point. Life is risked, as in dueling, by Europeans, for the mere point of honor, but it is never deliberately laid down in satisfaction of the exigencies of the social code. I will send you whatever information I can obtain when it reaches me, but that will not of course be for some months. Yours truly, Valentine Kyrall. P.S. A friend of mine who has just been here entirely confirms my own belief as to the accuracy of your statement, and tells me he has himself seen several imperial decrees in the Peking Gazette, calling provincial authorities to order for having allowed specific cases of substitution to occur, and ordering the death penalty to be carried out in a more severe form on the original culprits as an extra punishment for obtaining substitutes. He has promised to look up some of these IMB decrees on his return to China, and send me translations. I am satisfied personally that his statement is conclusive. V.C. On the same subject I have received the following letter from Mr. J.O.P. Bland, for 14 years correspondent of the Times in China. The Clock House, Shepperton, March 22, 1911. Dear Professor Frazer, my friend Mr. Valentine Kyrall, writing the other day from Crete on his way east, asked me to communicate with you on the subject of your letter of the 3rd ulto, namely, the custom, alleged to exist in China, of procuring substitutes for persons condemned to death, the substitutes' families or relatives, receiving compensation in cash. To speak of this as a custom is to exaggerate the frequency of a class of incident which has undoubtedly been recorded in China and of which there has been mention in imperial decrees. I am sorry to say that I have not my file of the Peking Gazette here for immediate reference, but I am writing to my friend Mr. Backhouse in Peking, and have no doubt but that he will be able to give chapter and verse of instances thus recorded. I had expected to find cases of the kind recorded in Mr. Werner's recently published Descriptive Sociology of the Chinese Spencerian publications, but have not been able to do so in the absence of an index to that voluminous work. More than one of the authors whom he quotes have certainly referred to cases of substitution for death sentence prisoners. Parker, for instance, China Past and Present, page 378, asserts that substitutes were to be had in Canton at the reasonable price of 50 taels, say £10. Dr. Matignon, in Superstition, Crime at Misere and Kine, page 113, says that filial piety is a frequent motive. The negative opinion of Professors Giles and de Groot is entitled to consideration, but cannot be regarded as any more conclusive than the views expressed by Professor Giles on the question of infanticide, which are outweighed by a mass of direct proof of eyewitnesses. In a country where men submit voluntarily to mutilation and grave risk of death for a comparatively small gain to themselves and their relatives, where women commit suicide in hundreds to escape capture by invaders or strangers, where men and women alike habitually sacrifice their life for the most trivial motives of revenge or distress, it need not greatly surprise us that some should be found, especially among the wretchedly poor class, willing to give up their life in order to relieve their families of want or otherwise to acquire merit. The most important thing I think, in expressing any opinion about the Chinese, is to remember the great extent and heterogeneous elements of the country, and to abstain from any sweeping generalizations based on isolated acts or events. Yours very truly, J.O.P. Bland. As the practice in question involves a grave miscarriage of justice, the discovery of which might entail serious consequences on the magistrate who connived at it, we need not wonder that it is generally hushed up, and that no instances of it should come to the ears of many Europeans resident in China. My friend Professor H. A. Giles of Cambridge in conversation expressed himself quite incredulous on the subject, and Professor J.J.M. de Groot of Leiden wrote to me, January 31, 1902, to the same effect. The Rev. Dr. W. T. A. Barber, headmaster of the Lay School, Cambridge, and formerly a missionary in China, wrote to me, January 30, 1902, as to the possibility that a man condemned to death may secure a substitute on payment of a moderate sum of money. We used to hear that this was the case, but I have no proof that would justify you in using the fact. Another experienced missionary, the Reverend W. A. Cornaby, wrote to Dr. Barber, I have heard of no such custom in capital crimes. The man in whose house a fire starts may, and often does, pay another to receive the blows and 3 days in a kang. But unless where foreign rights were the case, and a previously condemned criminal handy, I should hardly think it possible. Every precaution is taken that no one is beheaded but the man who cannot possibly be let off. The expense on the county mandarin is over £100 in stationary expenses with higher courts. On this I would observe, that if every execution costs the local mandarin so dear, he must be under a strong temptation to get the expenses out of the prisoner whenever he can do so without being detected. M217. With regard to the custom, mentioned by Mr. Cornaby, of procuring substitutes for corporal punishment, we are told that in China there are men who earn a livelihood by being thrashed instead of the real culprits. But they bribe the executioner to lay on lightly. Otherwise their constitution could not long resist the tyranny whereof so exhausting a profession. 727. Thus the theory and practice of vicarious suffering are well understood in China. Note B. Swinging as a magical rite. M218. The custom of swinging has been practiced as a religious or rather, magical rite in various parts of the world, but it does not seem possible to explain all the instances of it in the same way. People appear to have resorted to the practice from different motives and with different ideas of the benefit to be derived from it. In the text we have seen that the Let's, and perhaps the Siamese, swing to make the crops grow tall. 728. The same may be the intention of the ceremony whenever it is specially observed at harvest festivals. Among the Bughanese and Macassars of Celebes, for example, it used to be the custom for young girls to swing, one after the other on these occasions. 729. At the Great Dasera festival of Nepal, which immediately precedes the cutting of the rice, swings and kites come into fashion among the young people of both sexes. The swings are sometimes hung from boughs of trees, but generally from a crossbeam, supported on a framework of tall bamboos. 730. Among the Dayaks of Sarawak, a feast is held at the end of harvest, when the soul of the rice is secured to prevent the crops from rotting away. On this occasion a number of old women rock to and fro on a rude swing suspended from the rafters. 731. A traveler in Sarawak has described how he saw many tall swings erected and Dayaks swinging to and fro on them, sometimes 10 or 12 men together on one swing, while they chanted in monotonous, dirge-like tones an invocation to the spirits that they would be pleased to grant a plentiful harvest of sago and fruit in the good fishing season. 732. M219. In the East Indian island of Bengal, elaborate and costly ceremonies are performed to ensure a good catch of fish. Among the rest an hereditary priestess, who bears the royal title of Jinjang Raja, works herself up by means of the fumes of incense and so forth into that state of mental disorder which with many people passes for a symptom of divine inspiration. In this pious frame of mind she is led by her 4 handmaids, to a swing all covered with yellow and hung with golden bells, on which she takes her seat amid the jingle of the bells. As she rocks gently to and fro in the swing, she speaks in an unknown tongue to each of the 16 spirits who have to do with the fishing. 733. In order to procure a plentiful supply of game, the 10 Indians of Northwest America perform a magical ceremony which they call the young man bounding or tied. They pinion a man tightly, and having hung him by the head and heels from the roof of the hut, rock him backwards and forwards. 734. M220. Thus we see that people swing in order to procure a plentiful supply of fish and game as well as good crops. In such cases the notion seems to be that the ceremony promotes fertility, whether in the vegetable or the animal kingdom. Though why it should be supposed to do so, I confess myself unable to explain. There seem to be some reasons for thinking that the Indian rite of swinging on hooks run through the flesh of the performer is also resorted to, at least in some cases, from a belief in its fertilizing virtue. Thus Hamilton tells us that at Karwar, on the west coast of India, a feast is held at the end of May or beginning of June in honor of the infernal gods, with a divination or conjuration, to know the fate of the ensuing crop of corn. Men were hung from a pole, by means of tender hooks inserted in the flesh of their backs. And the pole with the men dangling from it was then dragged for more than a mile, over plowed ground from one sacred grove to another, preceded by a young girl who carried a pot of fire on her head. When the second grove was reached, the men were let down and taken off the hooks, and the girl fell into the usual prophetic frenzy, after which she unfolded to the priests the revelation with which she had just been favored by the terrestrial gods. In each of the groves a shapeless black stone, daubed with red lead, to stand for a mouth, eyes, and ears, appears to have represented the indwelling divinity. 735. Sometimes this custom of swinging on hooks, which is known among the Hindus as Churak Puja, seems to be intended to propitiate demons. Some Santals asked Mr. Vibal to be allowed to perform it because their women and children were dying of sickness, and their cattle were being killed by wild beasts. They believed that these misfortunes befell them because the evil spirits had not been appeased. 736. These same Santals celebrate a swinging festival of a less barbarous sort about the month of February. 8 men sit in chairs and rotate round posts in a sort of revolving swing, like the merry-go-rounds, which are so dear to children at English fairs. 737. At the Nowruz and Eid festivals in Dardistan the women swing on ropes suspended from trees. 738. During the rainy season in Bough young women swing in their houses, while they sing songs appropriate to the season, the period during which they indulge in this pastime, if a mere pastime it be, is strictly limited. It begins with a festival which usually falls on the 25th of the month Jade and ends with another festival which commonly takes place on the 25th of the month Asan. No one would think of swinging at any other time of the year. 739. It is possible that this last custom may be nothing more than a pastime meant to while away some of the tedious hours of the inclement season. But its limitation to a certain clearly defined portion of the year seems rather to point to a religious or magical origin. Possibly the intention may once have been to drive away the rain. We shall see immediately that swinging is sometimes resorted to for the purpose of expelling the powers of evil. About the middle of March the Hindus observe a swinging festival of a different sort in honor of the god Krishna, whose image is placed in the seat or cradle of a swing and, then, just when the dawn is breaking, rocked gently to and fro several times. The same ceremony is repeated at noon and at sunset. 740. In the Rig Veda the sun is called, by a natural metaphor, the golden swing in the sky, and the expression helps us to understand a ceremony of Vedic India. A priest sat in a swing and touched with the span of his right hand at once the seat of the swing and the ground. In doing so he said, "The great Lord has united himself with the great lady, the god has united himself with the goddess." Perhaps he meant to indicate in a graphic way that the sun had reached that lowest point of its course where it was nearest to the earth. 741. In this connection it is of interest to note that in the Estonian celebration of St. John's Day or the summer solstice swings, play, along with bonfires, the most prominent part. Girls sit and swing the whole night through, singing old songs to explain why they do so. 4. Legend tells of an Estonian prince who wooed in one an Icelandic princess. But a wicked enchanter spirited away the lover to a desert island, where he languished in captivity, till his lady love contrived to break the magic spell that bound him. Together they sailed home to Estonia, which they reached on St. John's Day, and burnt their ship, resolved to stray no longer in far foreign lands. The swings in which the Estonian maidens still rock themselves on St. John's Day are said to recall the ship in which the lovers tossed upon the stormy sea, and the bonfires commemorate the burning of it. When the fires have died out, the swings are laid aside and never used again either in the village or at the solitary alehouse until spring comes round once more. 742. Here it is natural to connect both swings and bonfires with the apparent course of the sun, who reaches the highest and turning point of his orbit on St. John's Day. Bonfires and swings perhaps were originally charms intended to kindle and speed afresh on its heavenly road the golden swing in the sky. Among the Lets of South Livonia and Kurland, the summer solstice is the occasion of a great festival of flowers, at which the people sing songs with the constant refrain of lihtgo, lihtgo. It has been proposed to derive the word lihtgo from the Lettish verb ligod, to swing, with reference to the sun swinging in the sky at this turning point of his course. 743. M221. At Tangruing, in eastern Borneo, the priests and priestesses receive the inspiration of the spirits seated in swings and rocking themselves to and fro. Thus suspended in the air, they appear to be in a peculiarly favorable position for catching the divine afflatus. One end of the plank which forms the seat of the priest's swing is carved in the rude likeness of a crocodile's head. The swing of the priestess is similarly ornamented with a serpent's head. 744. M222. Again, swings are used for the cure of sickness, but it is the doctor who rocks himself in them, not the patient. In North Borneo, the Dayak medicine man will sometimes erect a swing in front of the sick man's house and sway backwards and forwards on it for the purpose of kicking away the disease, frightening away evil spirits, and catching the stray soul of the sufferer. 745. Clearly in his passage through the air, the physician is likely to collide with the disease and the evil spirits, both of which are sure to be loitering about in the neighborhood of the patient, and the rude shock thus given to the malady and the demons may reasonably be expected to push or hustle them away. At Tangruing, in eastern Borneo, a traveler witnessed a ceremony for the expulsion of an evil spirit in which swinging played a part. After 4 men in blue shirts, bespangled with stars, and wearing coronets of red cloth decorated with beads and bells, had sought diligently for the devil, grabbling about on the floor and grunting withal, 3 hideous hags dressed in faded red petticoats were brought in with great pomp, carried on the shoulders of Malays, and took their seats, amid solemn silence, on the cradle of a swing, the ends of which were carved to represent the head and tail of a crocodile. Not a sound escaped from the crowd of spectators during this awe-inspiring ceremony. They regarded the business as most serious. The venerable dames then rocked to and fro on the swing, fanning themselves languidly with Chinese paper fans. At a later stage of the performance, they and 3 girls discharged burning arrows at a sort of altar of banana leaves, maize, and grass. This completed the discomfiture of the devil. 746. M223. The Athenians in antiquity celebrated an annual festival of swinging. Boards were hung from trees by ropes, and people sitting on them swung to and fro, while they sang songs of a loose or voluptuous character. The swinging went on both in public and private. Various explanations were given of the custom. The most generally received was as follows. When Bacchus came among men to make known to them the pleasures of wine, he lodged with a certain Icarus or Icarius, to whom he revealed the precious secret and bade him go forth and carry the glad tidings to all the world. So Icarus loaded a wagon with wineskins, and set out on his travels, the dog Mara running beside him. He came to Attica, and there fell in with shepherds tending their sheep, to whom he gave of the wine. They drank greedily, but when some of them fell down dead drunk, their companions thought the stranger had poisoned them with intent to steal the sheep. So they knocked him on the head. The faithful dog ran home and got at his master's daughter Eragon to the body. At sight of it, she was smitten with despair and hanged herself on a tree beside her dead father, but not until she had prayed that, unless the Athenians should avenge her sire's murder, their daughters might die the same death as she. Her curse was fulfilled, for soon many Athenian damsels hanged themselves, for no obvious reason. An oracle informed the Athenians of the true cause of this epidemic of suicide. So they sought out the bodies of the unhappy pair and instituted the swinging festival to appease Eragon. And at the vintage they offered the first of the grapes to her and her father. 747. M224. Thus the swinging festival at Athens was regarded by the ancients as an expiation for a suicide or suicides by hanging. This opinion is strongly confirmed by a statement of Varro, that it was unlawful to perform funeral rites in honor of persons who had died by hanging, but that in their case such rites were replaced by a custom of swinging images, as if in imitation of the death they had died. 748. Servius says that the Athenians, failing to find the bodies of Icarius and Eragon on earth, made a pretense of seeking them in the air by swinging on ropes hung from trees. And he seems to have regarded the custom of swinging as a purification by means of air. 749. This explanation probably comes very near the truth. Indeed, if we substitute souls for bodies in the wording of it, we may almost accept it as exact. It might be thought that the souls of persons who had died by hanging were more than the souls of the other dead, hovering in the air, since their bodies were suspended in air at the moment of death. Hence it would be considered needful to purge the air of these vagrant spirits, and this might be done by swinging persons or things to and fro, in order that by their impact they might disperse and drive away the baleful ghosts. Thus the custom would be exactly analogous, on the one hand, to the practice of the Malay medicine man, who swings to and fro in front of the patient's house in order to chase away the disease, or to frighten away evil spirits, or to catch the stray soul of the sick man, and, on the other hand, to the practice of the Central Australian Aborigines who beat the air with their weapons and hands in order to drive the lingering ghost away to the grave. 750. At Rome, swinging seems to have formed part of the great Latin festival, Feri Latinae, and its origin was traced to a search in the air for the body or even the soul of King Latinus, who had disappeared from earth after the battle with Mezentius, king of Caire. 751. M225. Yet on the other hand there are circumstances which point to an intimate association, both at Athens and Rome, of these swinging festivals, with an intention of promoting the growth of cultivated plants. Such circumstances are the legendary connection of the Athenian festival with Bacchus, the custom of offering the first fruits of the vintage to Eragon and Icarius, 752, and at Rome the practice of hanging masks on trees at the time of sowing, 753, and in order to make the grapes grow better. 754. Perhaps we can reconcile the two apparently discrepant effects attributed to swinging as a means of expiation on the one side and to fertilization, on the other, by supposing that in both cases the intention is to clear the air of dangerous influences, whether these are ghosts of the unburied, dead or spiritual powers inimical to the growth of plants. Independent of both appears to be the notion that the higher you swing the higher will grow the crops. 755. This last is homeopathic or imitative magic, pure and simple, without any admixture of the ideas of purification or expiation. M226. In modern Greece and Italy the custom of swinging as a festal rite, whatever its origin may be, is still observed in some places. At the small village of Calgara in Alice, an English traveller observed peasants swinging from a tree in honor of St. George, whose festival it was. 756. On the Tuesday after Easter the maidens of Seriphos play their favorite game of the swing. They hang a rope from one wall to another of the steep, narrow, filthy street, and putting some clothes on it swing one after the other, singing as they swing. young men who try to pass are called upon to pay toll in the shape of a penny, a song, and a swing. The words which the youth sings are generally these: the gold is swung, the silver is swung, and swung too is my love with the golden hair. To which the girl replies, who is it that swings me that I may gild him with my favor, that I may work him a fez all covered with pearls? 757. In the Greek island of Carpathos, the villagers assemble at a given place on each of the 4 Sundays before Easter. A swing is erected, and the women swing one after the other, singing death wails such as they chant round the mimic tombs in church on the night of Good Friday. 758. On Christmas Day, peasant girls in some villages of Calabria fasten ropes to iron rings in the ceiling and swing on them, while they sing certain songs prescribed by custom for the occasion. The practice is regarded not merely as an amusement but also as an act of devotion. 759. It is a custom in Cadiz, when Christmas comes, to fasten swings in the courtyards of houses, and even in the houses themselves when there is no room for them outside. In the evenings lads and lasses assemble round the swings and pass the time happily in swinging, amid joyous songs and cries. The swings are taken down when carnival is come. 760. The observance of the custom at Christmas, that is, at the winter solstice, suggests that in Calabria and Spain, as in Estonia, the pastime may originally have been a magical rite designed to assist the sun in climbing the steep ascent to the top of the summer sky. If this were so, we might surmise that the gold and the golden hair mentioned by youths and maidens of Seraphos as they swing refer to the golden swing in the sky, in other words to the sun whose golden lamp swings daily across the blue vault of heaven. M227. However that may be, it would seem that festivals of swinging are especially held in spring. This is true, for example, of North Africa, where such festivals are common. At some places in that part of the world, the date of the swinging is the time of the apricots. At others it is said to be the spring equinox. In some places the festival lasts 3 days, and fathers who have had children born to them within the year bring them and swing them in the swings. 761. In Korea the 5th day of the 5th moon is called Tano Nao. Ancestors are then worshipped, and swings are put up in the yards of most houses for the amusement of the people. The women on this day may go about the streets. During the rest of the year, they may go out only after dark. Dressed in their prettiest clothes, they visit the various houses and amuse themselves swinging. The swing is said to convey the idea of keeping cool in the approaching summer. It is one of the most popular feasts of the year. 762. Perhaps the reason here assigned for swinging may explain other instances of the custom. On the principles of homeopathic magic, the swinging may be regarded as a means of ensuring a succession of cool, refreshing breezes during the oppressive heat of the ensuing summer. Addenda. Pages 104. The sacred precinct of Pelops at Olympia. It deserves to be noted that just as Pelops, whose legend reflects the origin of the chariot race, had a sacred precinct and probably his tomb at Olympia, in like manner Endymion, whose legend reflects the origin of the foot race, 763, had his tomb at the end of the Olympic Stadium, at the point where the runners started in the race. 764. This presence at Olympia, of the graves of the 2 early kings, whose names are associated with the origin of the foot race and of the chariot race respectively, can hardly be without significance. It indicates the important part played by the dead in the foundation of the Olympic Games. Pages 188. A man is literally reborn in the person of his son. This belief in the possible rebirth of the parent in the child may sometimes explain the seemingly widespread dislike of people to have children like themselves. Examples of such a dislike have met us in a former part of this work. 765. A similar superstition prevails among the Papuans of Dore Bay in Dutch New Guinea. When a son resembles his father or a daughter resembles her mother,